The earliest traces of what would eventually become Druidic tradition emerge from the archaeological record of Iron Age Europe like whispers from a distant past. Deep within the ritual deposits of sacred springs, beneath the earthen ramparts of hill forts, and within the carefully arranged stone circles that dot the ancient landscape, we find evidence of sophisticated religious practices that predate any written account of the Druids themselves by centuries. At Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France, excavations have revealed a rectangular enclosure dating to the 3rd century BC, its boundaries marked by a wooden palisade and containing what appears to be a sacred grove. Within this space, archaeologists discovered thousands of weapons, swords, spearheads, shields, deliberately bent and broken before being deposited in carefully dug pits. These weren't discarded battlefield refuse, but ritual offerings, their destruction ensuring they could serve only the gods. The systematic nature of these deposits, their careful placement, and the evident ceremonial protocols involved suggest the presence of an organised priestly class directing these complex rituals. Similar patterns emerge across the Celtic world. At Ribemont-sur-Ancre, also in northern France, excavations revealed a massive ossuary containing the remains of over 1,000 individuals, their bones arranged in precise geometric patterns. The skulls were separated from the bodies and placed in distinct areas, while long bones were sorted and stacked with mathematical precision. This wasn't random violence, but carefully orchestrated ritual activity requiring extensive anatomical knowledge and religious authority to direct such elaborate post-mortem ceremonies. The sacred springs of Britain and Gaul provide perhaps the most compelling evidence for proto-Druidic practices. At Bath's sacred springs dedicated to the goddess Sulis, thousands of curse tablets written on thin sheets of lead have been recovered from the waters. While many date to the Roman period, the practice itself clearly predates Roman arrival. These deficciones, as scholars term them, required not only literacy but deep knowledge of proper formulaic language to compel divine intervention. The complexity of their legal terminology and religious invocations suggests a learned class of religious specialists who understood both divine law and human jurisprudence. Across the channel at the source of the Seine, similar deposits reveal the sophistication of pre-Roman Celtic religious practice. Wooden sculptures, anatomical votives representing healed body parts, and bronze figurines were carefully deposited in the sacred waters over centuries. The artistic consistency and religious iconography of these offerings indicate established traditions passed down through generations of religious practitioners who maintained both artistic standards and theological doctrine. The construction of major ritual sites provides additional evidence for organised religious authority in pre-Roman Celtic society. The Heuneberg Hill Fort in southwestern Germany, occupied from the 7th to 5th centuries BC, contained elaborate ritual buildings constructed with Mediterranean architectural techniques. These weren't simple shrines, but sophisticated religious complexes requiring extensive planning, specialised knowledge, and coordinated labour forces. The presence of imported luxury goods within these contexts, Greek pottery, Etruscan bronzes, amber from the Baltic, indicates that religious authority commanded significant economic resources and maintained far-reaching trade networks. The Indo-European heritage underlying Celtic religious traditions provides crucial context for understanding Druidic origins. Comparative mythology reveals striking parallels between Celtic religious concepts and those found across the Indo-European world. The tripartite division of society into priests, warriors, and producers that characterise Celtic culture mirrors similar structures in ancient India, Iran, and Rome. This wasn't coincidental borrowing, but reflected shared ancestral traditions carried by Indo-European speaking peoples as they spread across Eurasia during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. The concept of sacred kingship, fundamental to later Celtic political and religious structures, shows clear Indo-European origins. Like their counterparts in Vedic India and ancient Iran, Celtic rulers were expected to maintain cosmic order through proper ritual observance. The king's relationship with the land was conceived in sacred terms. His ritual purity and correct performance of seasonal ceremonies directly affected agricultural fertility and tribal prosperity. This religious dimension of kingship required specialized knowledge of proper protocols, seasonal timing, and ritual procedures that only trained religious specialists could provide. The Indo-European inheritance also included sophisticated concepts of cosmic structure that would later characterize Celtic religious thought. The world tree, connecting the realms of gods, humans, and the dead, appears in Celtic mythology as it does in Germanic, Baltic, and Indo-Iranian traditions. The threefold division of the cosmos, upper world of gods, middle world of humans, and underworld of the dead, provided the basic framework for Celtic religious geography. These weren't simple borrowings, but represented ancient shared concepts that each Indo-European culture developed according to local conditions and historical experiences. The emergence of distinctly Celtic culture across Europe between 1200 and 500 BC created the specific historical context within which Druidic traditions would crystallize. The Hallstatt culture, centered in the salt mining regions of Austria, developed the earliest recognizably Celtic material culture around 800 BC. The wealth generated by salt trade, a commodity essential for food preservation and therefore political power, enabled the development of a warrior aristocracy supported by specialized craftsmen and religious specialists. The Latin culture, emerging around 450 BC, represents the full flowering of Celtic civilization. Named after the ritual site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where thousands of weapons and ornaments were deposited in the waters, Latin culture spread rapidly across Europe from Ireland to Turkey. The artistic style that characterizes this period, flowing curvilinear designs, stylized animal forms, complex geometric patterns, wasn't merely decorative but encoded religious symbolism requiring trained specialists to interpret and reproduce correctly. The expansion of Celtic culture wasn't simply military conquest, but involved the spread of religious and legal traditions that required educated specialists to maintain. As Celtic tribes established themselves across Europe, they carried with them not just material culture, but complex bodies of oral tradition, including genealogies, legal precedents, religious formulae, and mythological narratives. The preservation and transmission of this knowledge required dedicated specialists who could memorize vast quantities of information and adapt traditional teachings to local conditions. Linguistic analysis of Celtic languages reveals the antiquity and sophistication of religious terminology that predates written records by centuries. The word Druid itself derives from the Proto-Celtic asterisk Druids, combining asterisk Dru with asterisk wid. This compound suggests not simply oak knower, but someone who possessed the ability to perceive sacred knowledge through natural phenomena. The linguistic construction parallels similar compounds in other Indo-European languages, where religious specialists were defined by their ability to see or know hidden truths. The Celtic term Watis, preserved in Irish faith and Welsh Gwawd, designated a type of religious specialist concerned with prophecy and poetic inspiration. The word shares etymological connections with Latin vetus and Germanic terms for prophetic speech, indicating ancient Indo-European concepts of divinely inspired utterance. The preservation of these terms across geographically separated Celtic languages suggests they represented established religious categories maintained through oral tradition over centuries. Sacred geography terminology reveals sophisticated concepts of ritual space that required specialized knowledge to navigate properly. The Celtic asterisk nematon, meaning sacred grove or sanctuary, appears in place names across the Celtic world from Druinemeton in Asia Minor to Vernametum in Britain. These weren't simply wooded areas, but carefully defined ritual spaces with specific protocols for entry, behaviour, and ceremonial activity. The consistency of terminology across such vast geographical distances indicates standardized religious concepts transmitted through networks of trained specialists. The legal terminology preserved in early Irish and Welsh law texts reveals the complexity of pre-Christian Celtic jurisprudence. Technical terms for different categories of contracts, property rights, and legal procedures show remarkable consistency with legal concepts found in other Indo-European traditions. The precision of this vocabulary and its systematic application in complex legal scenarios required extensive training that could only be provided by professional legal specialists who combined jurisprudence with religious authority. Seasonal and calendrical terminology demonstrates sophisticated astronomical knowledge integrated with religious observance. The Coligny calendar, discovered in France and dating to the 1st century BC, represents the culmination of centuries of Celtic astronomical observation. Its complex intercalation system, designed to coordinate lunar months with the solar year, required mathematical knowledge and observational skills that could only be maintained by dedicated specialists. The religious terminology embedded within the calendar, designating auspicious and inauspicious periods, seasonal ceremonies, and divine festivals, shows the integration of astronomical knowledge with religious practice. The preservation of mythological narratives in Celtic languages reveals sophisticated theological concepts that required trained specialists to maintain and interpret. The complex genealogies connecting divine and human lineages, the intricate relationships between tribal deities and territorial boundaries, and the elaborate protocols governing interaction between the human and divine realms all demanded extensive memorization and deep understanding of traditional teachings. The transition from archaeological inference to documented historical reality occurs dramatically with Julius Caesar's arrival in Gaul in 58 BC. For the first time in recorded history, we encountered detailed written accounts of the Druids from an outside observer who claimed direct interaction with these enigmatic figures. Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written between 58 and 50 BC, provides our most comprehensive classical description of Druidic society, though his account must be carefully examined through the lens of Roman political and military objectives. Caesar's description of the Druidic hierarchy reveals a sophisticated religious organization that controlled significant aspects of Celtic society. According to his account, the Druids formed a distinct social class exempt from military service and taxation, privileges that elevated them above even the warrior aristocracy in certain respects. At the apex of this hierarchy stood a single chief Druid who held supreme authority over all religious matters throughout Gaul. This position was either inherited through succession or, more commonly, elected by the Druidic assembly when the previous holder died. The electoral process Caesar describes suggests a democratic element within Druidic organization that contrasted sharply with the autocratic structures Romans typically encountered. When multiple candidates sought the chief Druidic position, the decision was made through voting by the assembled Druids. If this process failed to produce a clear winner, armed conflict could result, indicating that despite their religious nature, Druids were willing to employ violence to resolve succession disputes. This detail reveals the substantial political power at stake in Druidic leadership positions. Caesar's account of Druidic education provides remarkable insights into Celtic intellectual culture. He reports that Druidic training required 20 years of intensive study, during which students memorized vast quantities of oral tradition without committing any of it to writing. This prohibition against written records, according to Caesar, served two purposes. It prevented sacred knowledge from falling into unauthorized hands, and it strengthened memory through constant exercise. The curriculum included natural philosophy, astronomy, theology, and what Caesar terms the immortality of souls and their passage after death to other bodies. The geographical scope of Druidic education impressed even Caesar, who noted that students travelled from across Gaul and Britain to study in particular centres of learning. He identifies Britain as the original homeland of Druidic tradition, suggesting that the most advanced teachings could only be obtained there. This claim, if accurate, indicates that despite political fragmentation among Celtic tribes, intellectual and religious networks maintained connections across vast distances and tribal boundaries. Caesar's description of Druidic judicial functions reveals their role as arbiters in both religious and secular disputes. The Druids served as judges in cases involving murder, inheritance, and boundary disputes, with their decisions carrying binding authority backed by the threat of religious sanctions. The most severe punishment they could impose was exclusion from religious ceremonies, which effectively made the condemned person an outcast from society. Caesar notes that individuals suffering this punishment were shunned by all members of their community and could neither participate in religious rites nor seek legal protection. The annual assembly of Druids at a sacred location in the territory of the Carnutes tribe demonstrates the institutional unity underlying Celtic religious organisation. Caesar describes this gathering as occurring at what the Druids considered the centre of Gaul, where representatives from across the Celtic world convened to resolve disputes and coordinate religious policy. The fact that even warring tribes respected the neutrality of this assembly indicates the transcendent authority Druids wielded over political divisions. Caesar's account of Druidic human sacrifice practices provides some of the most controversial material in classical sources. He describes various methods of ritual killing, including the construction of enormous wicker figures filled with living victims and set ablaze. While these descriptions have captured popular imagination, they must be evaluated carefully considering Caesar's political motivations and Roman attitudes toward non-Roman religious practices. The Romans routinely accused foreign peoples of practicing human sacrifice as justification for military intervention and cultural suppression. Archaeological evidence from Celtic sites does confirm the practice of ritual human sacrifice in certain contexts, but the scale and systematic nature Caesar describes may reflect Roman propaganda rather than accurate observation. Bog bodies discovered across northern Europe, some showing evidence of ritual killing, demonstrate that human sacrifice occurred within Celtic religious practice, but these isolated finds hardly support Caesar's claims of widespread routine mass sacrifice. Pliny the Elder's Natural History, completed around 77 as 79 AD, provides a different perspective on Druidic practices focused on their relationship with the natural world. Writing a century after Caesar, Pliny had access to additional sources and could observe the remnants of Druidic tradition that persisted despite Roman suppression efforts. His account emphasizes the botanical and medical knowledge that formed a crucial component of Druidic expertise. Pliny's description of the mistletoe ceremony represents one of the most detailed ritual accounts in classical literature. According to his account, Druids considered mistletoe sacred only when it grew on oak trees, a rare occurrence that made such specimens particularly precious. The harvest ceremony could only be performed on the 6th day of the lunar month, using a golden sickle wielded by a white-robed druid who climbed the tree while other participants waited below with a white cloth to catch the falling plant. The ritual requirements Pliny describes reveal the precision and formality of Druidic ceremonial practice. 2 white bulls were sacrificed during the ceremony, and the harvested mistletoe was distributed among participants who believed it provided protection against poison and enhanced fertility in livestock. The specific timing requirements, the 6th day of the lunar month, demonstrate sophisticated astronomical knowledge integrated with religious observance. Pliny's account of sacred groves provides insights into Celtic concepts of sacred space that archaeological evidence supports. He describes these groves as carefully maintained ritual areas where specific trees were considered dwelling places of particular deities. The Druids served as guardians of these spaces, ensuring that proper protocols were observed and that unauthorized individuals did not disturb the sacred environment. Archaeological excavations at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde have confirmed the existence of such carefully defined ritual spaces with evidence of long-term maintenance and repeated ceremonial use. The botanical knowledge Pliny attributes to the Druids reflects genuine expertise in herbal medicine and natural philosophy. His catalogue of plants considered sacred by the Druids includes detailed descriptions of their supposed properties and ritual applications. While some of these claims reflect magical thinking rather than empirical observation, others demonstrate accurate knowledge of plant properties that modern pharmacology has confirmed. The systematic nature of this botanical knowledge suggests formal educational traditions that transmitted detailed information about plant identification, preparation methods, and therapeutic applications. Pliny's account of Druidic astronomy reveals sophisticated observational capabilities that enabled accurate calendar construction and seasonal prediction. He describes Druids as capable of predicting eclipses, calculating optimal times for agricultural activities, and determining auspicious periods for various undertakings. This astronomical knowledge required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation, supporting Caesar's claims about the lengthy educational requirements for Druidic training. Tacitus provides the most dramatic and politically charged accounts of Druidic activities in his Annals and Agricola, written in the early 2nd century AD. His descriptions focus primarily on the final confrontation between Roman authority and Druidic resistance in Britain, particularly the assault on the island of Mona in 60 AD under the command of Suetonius Paulinus. Tacitus's account of the Mona campaign provides vivid details of the final stronghold of British Druidism. He describes the island as heavily fortified and serving as a refuge for rebels from across Britain who sought sanctuary under Druidic protection. The Roman approach to the island was complicated by the need to transport troops across the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait, where tidal currents and shallow areas made naval operations hazardous. The scene Tacitus paints of the British defence of Mona reveals the psychological impact of Druidic resistance on Roman soldiers. He describes armed warriors interspersed with Druids who raised their hands to heaven while invoking curses upon the Roman forces. Women dressed in funeral garments ran among the defenders like furies, carrying torches and adding to the otherworldly atmosphere that initially paralysed the Roman advance. The Druids themselves appeared in white robes, their appearance and ritual gestures creating such an impression that seasoned Roman veterans hesitated to advance. Tacitus records that Suetonius had to personally exhort his troops to overcome their superstitious fears and advance against what he characterized as a savage superstition. The Roman assault, when it finally came, was devastating. The defenders were overwhelmed, the sacred groves were cut down, and the altars were destroyed. Tacitus specifically mentions that the Romans discovered evidence of human sacrifice, including altars soaked with human blood and groves where victims had been hanged. The destruction of Mona represented more than a military victory. It was a deliberate assault on the institutional foundation of British resistance to Roman rule. Tacitus makes clear that the Romans understood the Druids' role in coordinating opposition to Roman authority, and that eliminating their power base was essential for consolidating Roman control over Britain. The timing of the attack, occurring simultaneously with Boudicca's rebellion in eastern Britain, demonstrates Roman recognition of the connection between Druidic authority and organised resistance to Roman rule. Tacitus's broader treatment of Druids in his historical works reveals their continued influence even after official suppression. He mentions Druidic involvement in the revolt of Civilis in 69, 70 AD, where Druidic prophecies encouraged Germanic and Gallic tribes to believe that the burning of the capital in Rome signalled the transfer of world dominion to peoples beyond the Alps. This incident demonstrates that Druidic influence persisted decades after Caesar's conquest of Gaul and continued to pose challenges to Roman authority. The critical analysis of these classical sources requires careful consideration of Roman cultural biases and political objectives that shaped their accounts. Roman authors wrote for Roman audiences with specific expectations about barbarian peoples and their religious practices. The Romans had a complex relationship with foreign religions, sometimes incorporating useful elements while condemning practices that conflicted with Roman values or political interests. The accusation of human sacrifice appears consistently across Roman accounts of various non-Roman peoples, from Carthaginians to Germans to Celts. While archaeological evidence confirms that ritual human sacrifice occurred in Celtic contexts, the systematic and extensive nature described by Roman authors likely reflects literary conventions rather than accurate reporting. Roman authors used accusations of human sacrifice to justify military intervention and cultural suppression, making it difficult to distinguish factual observation from propaganda. The Roman emphasis on Druidic secrecy and refusal to commit teachings to writing may reflect genuine Celtic practices, but it also served Roman rhetorical purposes by portraying Druids as deliberately obscure and potentially subversive. The Romans valued written law and public discourse, so the Druidic reliance on oral tradition could be portrayed as primitive or deliberately deceptive. However, the sophistication of Celtic legal and astronomical knowledge preserved in later Irish and Welsh sources suggests that oral transmission was a deliberate choice rather than an inability to develop writing systems. The political dimensions of Roman accounts become particularly apparent in their treatment of Druidic resistance to Roman authority. Roman authors consistently portray Druids as the primary organisers of anti-Roman sentiment, suggesting that eliminating Druidic influence was essential for successful conquest. While this assessment may have been accurate, it also served to justify harsh suppression measures and deflect attention from legitimate grievances that motivated Celtic resistance to Roman rule. The geographical claims and classical sources also require careful evaluation. Caesar's assertion that Druidism originated in Britain and spread to Gaul may reflect genuine historical tradition, but it could also serve his political purposes by suggesting that conquering Britain was necessary to eliminate Druidic influence entirely. Similarly, the emphasis on the unity of Druidic organisation across tribal boundaries may exaggerate the actual coordination among Celtic religious specialists for dramatic effect. Despite these limitations, the classical sources provide invaluable information about Druidic practices and social organisation that archaeological evidence alone cannot supply. The detailed descriptions of educational practices, judicial functions, and ceremonial activities offer insights into Celtic intellectual culture that complement material evidence from excavations. The consistency of certain details across different authors and time periods suggests that some aspects of their accounts reflect accurate observation rather than literary convention. The integration of classical sources with archaeological evidence and later Celtic literary traditions allows for a more nuanced understanding of Druidic society than any single source could provide. While Roman authors clearly had political and cultural biases that influenced their accounts, their direct contact with Celtic society during the conquest period provides contemporary observations that, when carefully analysed, reveal significant aspects of Druidic organisation and practice. The physical landscape of Celtic territories served as far more than mere backdrop to Druidic activities. It functioned as a carefully organised sacred geography, where natural features held specific religious significance and ritual purpose. Archaeological investigations across Europe have revealed systematic patterns in how Celtic communities organised their religious spaces, creating networks of sacred sites that connected local tribal territories with broader regional and pan-Celtic religious traditions. The identification of nemata, or sacred groves, represents one of the most significant developments in understanding Celtic religious geography. These carefully maintained woodland sanctuaries appear throughout the archaeological record from Scotland to Asia Minor, their locations marked by distinctive artefact assemblages and structural remains that distinguish them from ordinary settlements or burial sites.
At Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France, excavations revealed a rectangular enclosure measuring approximately 45 by 38 metres, surrounded by a wooden palisade with a single entrance facing east. Within this defined space, archaeologists discovered evidence of continuous ritual activity spanning over 2 centuries, from the 3rd century BC through the Roman conquest period. The Gournay site demonstrates the sophisticated organisation of nematon spaces. The central area contained a wooden temple structure built according to specific architectural principles that remained consistent across multiple reconstruction phases. Surrounding this temple, carefully arranged pits contained thousands of weapons, iron swords, spearheads, shields and helmets that had been deliberately damaged before deposition. The systematic nature of this destruction, involving specific bending and breaking patterns, indicates established ritual protocols that required specialised knowledge to execute properly. Similar Nemean sites across Celtic Europe reveal standardised approaches to sacred space organisation, despite significant geographical separation. At Mirabeau-sur-Bèze in Burgundy, a square enclosure dating to the 2nd century BC contained a central wooden building surrounded by pits filled with animal bones, pottery fragments and metalwork. The bone assemblages show evidence of systematic butchering and distribution, suggesting communal feasting activities that required coordination by religious specialists familiar with proper ceremonial procedures. The Ribemont-sur-Ancre site in Picardy provides particularly striking evidence for the scale and complexity of Nemetan activities. This sanctuary, active from the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, contained a massive ossuary where human remains were arranged according to strict anatomical principles. Skulls were separated from postcranial elements and placed in distinct areas, while long bones were sorted by type and stacked in geometric patterns. This systematic organisation of human remains required extensive anatomical knowledge and religious authority to direct such elaborate post-mortem ceremonies. Archaeological investigation of British Nemeta reveals similar organisational principles adapted to local geographical conditions. The Hayling Island Sanctuary in Hampshire, active from the 1st century BC through the Roman period, occupied a hilltop location overlooking the Solent. The site contained a circular wooden temple surrounded by a square enclosure with evidence of metalwork deposition, animal sacrifice, and votive offerings spanning several centuries. The consistency of ritual deposits and architectural features across multiple building phases indicates continuous maintenance by trained religious specialists. Stone circles represent another crucial component of Celtic sacred geography, though their relationship to historical Druidic practices remains complex due to their much earlier construction dates. The majority of British and Irish stone circles were erected during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, centuries before the emergence of recognisable Celtic culture. However, archaeological evidence demonstrates continued use and modification of these ancient monuments throughout the Iron Age, suggesting that Druids incorporated pre-existing sacred sites into their religious system. Stonehenge provides the most extensively studied example of this phenomenon. While the monument's primary construction phases date to the 3rd millennium BC, archaeological evidence reveals significant Iron Age activity at the site. Excavations have uncovered Celtic pottery, metalwork and human remains dating to the period of documented Druidic activity in Britain. The discovery of cremated human remains in the Aubrey holes, some dating to the Iron Age, suggests that Druids may have used the ancient monument for burial ceremonies connected to their religious practices. The Rollright stones in Oxfordshire demonstrate similar patterns of Iron Age reuse of earlier monuments. This Bronze Age stone circle shows evidence of continued ritual activity throughout the Celtic period, including the deposition of metalwork and the modification of individual stones. Local place name evidence suggests that the site retained religious significance into the medieval period, indicating continuity of sacred associations across multiple cultural transitions. Burial mounds and barrows throughout Celtic territories reveal sophisticated concepts of landscape organisation that connected the living community with ancestral spirits and territorial boundaries. The Hochdorf burial in southwestern Germany, dating to the 6th century BC, exemplifies the integration of individual burials within broader sacred landscapes. The massive tumulus, measuring over 60 metres in diameter, was positioned to be visible from surrounding settlements and aligned with significant astronomical events. The Vix burial in Burgundy, containing the remains of a high-status woman accompanied by extraordinary grave goods, including a massive bronze crater, demonstrates how elite burials served as focal points for territorial organisation. The burial mound's position commanded extensive views across the surrounding landscape, while its proximity to the Mont-Lassois hill fort suggests integration with political and religious centres of power. Irish passage tombs such as Newgrange, Noath and Douth in the Boyne Valley represent earlier traditions that Celtic communities incorporated into their religious geography. While these monuments date to the Neolithic period, medieval Irish texts describe them as Sid or fairy mounds, associated with the Tuatha de Danann and other supernatural beings. The continued significance of these sites in Irish tradition suggests that Druids maintained connections with ancient sacred places, adapting earlier religious concepts to Celtic theological frameworks. The ritual landscape approach to Celtic sacred geography reveals how individual sites functioned as components of integrated religious systems rather than isolated sanctuaries. In the Trier region of Germany, archaeological survey has identified clusters of Celtic temples, burial mounds and votive deposits organised according to specific spatial relationships. These site complexes were connected by ancient trackways, facilitated movement between different ritual locations during seasonal ceremonies or religious festivals. Water worship formed a fundamental component of Celtic religious practice, with springs, wells and rivers serving as crucial interfaces between the human and divine realms. The therapeutic springs at Bath, dedicated to the goddess Sulis, provide exceptional evidence for the sophistication of Celtic water cults. The natural hot springs, emerging at a constant temperature of 46 degrees Celsius, were developed into an elaborate sanctuary complex that attracted visitors from across Roman Britain and beyond. Archaeological excavations at Bath have recovered over 12,000 Roman coins thrown into the sacred spring as votive offerings, along with pewter vessels, jewellery and gemstones. Most significantly, the site has yielded approximately 130 curse tablets written on thin lead sheets and deposited in the spring waters. These defixianes, written in Latin but following Celtic legal and religious formulae, demonstrate the persistence of indigenous religious practices within the Roman cultural framework. The curse tablets reveal sophisticated understanding of divine law and proper procedures for seeking supernatural intervention in human disputes. The tablets typically begin with invocations to Sulis Minerva, combining the Celtic goddess with her Roman counterpart, followed by detailed descriptions of alleged crimes and requests for specific punishments. The legal terminology and formulaic language employed in these texts required specialised knowledge that could only be provided by religious specialists familiar with both Celtic and Roman legal traditions. Similar water sanctuaries across Celtic Europe demonstrate the widespread importance of spring and river worship in Celtic religious practice. At the source of the Seine in Burgundy, the sanctuary of Sequana yielded thousands of votive offerings deposited over several centuries. Wooden sculptures representing healed body parts, bronze figurines of pilgrims, and miniature representations of internal organs indicate that the site functioned as a healing sanctuary where visitors sought divine intervention for medical conditions. The Fontes Sequani site reveals the organised nature of Celtic pilgrimage practices. The votive deposits show evidence of systematic production by specialised craftsmen who created standardised offering types for different categories of supplicants. anatomical votives were carved according to established artistic conventions, while bronze figurines followed consistent iconographic patterns that required training to execute properly. This standardization suggests institutional oversight by religious specialists who maintained artistic and theological standards across extended periods. River deposits throughout Celtic territories provide additional evidence for water-focused ritual practices. The Thames in particular has yielded extraordinary quantities of high-status metalwork deposited during the Iron Age period. Weapons, tools, ornaments and cauldrons were thrown into the river at specific locations, often near fords or confluences that held special geographical significance. The concentration of these deposits at particular spots indicates established ritual sites, where ceremonies were conducted according to specific protocols. The Battersea Shield, discovered in the Thames and dating to the 1st century BC, exemplifies the quality of metalwork deposited in river sanctuaries. This bronze shield, decorated with elaborate Latini artistic motifs and originally fitted with glass studs, was clearly a prestige object rather than functional military equipment. Its deposition in the Thames represents a significant sacrifice that required authorization by religious authorities capable of determining appropriate offerings for water deities. Sacred wells throughout the Celtic world demonstrate the persistence of water worship traditions from prehistory through the medieval period. The Caroburg Mithraeum on Hadrian's Wall contained a sacred well where Roman soldiers deposited offerings to Celtic water deities alongside their devotions to Mithras. The site yielded altars dedicated to local nymphs and water spirits, indicating the continuation of indigenous religious practices within Roman military contexts. Irish holy wells preserve extensive evidence for Celtic water worship traditions that survived Christianization. Medieval texts describe elaborate ceremonies conducted at sacred springs, including circuits performed in specific directions, offerings deposited in the water, and healing rituals conducted by specialized practitioners. The persistence of these practices into the modern period suggests deep-rooted traditions that originated in pre-Christian Celtic religious systems. The island of Mona, known today as Anglesey, occupied a position of supreme importance within the sacred geography of Celtic Britain. Classical sources consistently identify Mona as the primary centre of Druidic learning and religious authority, a claim supported by archaeological evidence for intensive ritual activity spanning several centuries. The island's geographical position, separated from mainland Wales by the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait, provided natural protection that enabled the development of major religious institutions without interference from external political authorities. Tacitus's account of the Roman assault on Mona in 60 AD describes the island as heavily fortified and serving as a refuge for rebels from across Britain who sought sanctuary under Druidic protection. The Roman commander Suetonius Paulinus recognized that eliminating Druidic influence required the destruction of their institutional base on Mona, making the island's conquest a strategic priority despite the military challenges involved in mounting an amphibious assault across dangerous tidal waters. Archaeological investigation of Anglesey has revealed extensive evidence for Iron Age religious activity that supports classical claims about the island's significance. The Lyn Cerrig Bach deposit, discovered during construction of an RAF airfield in 1942, contained over 150 metalwork objects deposited in a lake over approximately 150 years during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The assemblage includes weapons, vehicle fittings, slave chains, cauldrons, and currency bars that represent offerings from across Britain and Ireland. The geographical distribution of objects in the Lyn Cerrig Bach deposit demonstrates Mona's role as a centre for pan-British religious activity. Weapons show stylistic influences from Scotland, Northern England and Ireland, while vehicle fittings display artistic motifs characteristic of continental Celtic metalwork traditions. This diversity indicates that the site attracted offerings from communities across the Celtic world, supporting classical claims about Mona's supreme religious status. The slave chains discovered at Lyn Cerrig provide disturbing evidence for the human cost of Celtic religious practices. These iron restraints, designed to secure multiple individuals in linked groups, were deposited in the lake as votive offerings, along with other high-value metalwork. The presence of such objects in a religious context suggests that human trafficking and slavery formed components of the economic system that supported major Celtic sanctuaries. Additional archaeological sites on Anglesey reveal the extent of Iron Age religious activity across the island. The Bryn Celli DDU passage tomb, originally constructed during the Neolithic period, shows evidence of continued use and modification throughout the Iron Age. The site contained cremated human remains, pottery and metalwork dating to the Celtic period, indicating that ancient burial monuments were incorporated into contemporary religious practices. The Din Ligwi Hut group on Anglesey provides evidence for specialised religious communities that may have been associated with Druidic training institutions. This late Iron Age settlement contained several round stone buildings arranged within a defensive enclosure, with evidence for metalworking, fine pottery production, and the consumption of high-status foods. The site's location, architectural sophistication, and artefact assemblage suggest occupation by religious specialists rather than ordinary farming communities. Holyhead Mountain on Anglesey contains extensive evidence for Iron Age ritual activity, including stone circles, burial cairns, and settlement remains that span several centuries. The mountain's prominent position, visible from across the Irish Sea, made it an ideal location for astronomical observation and seasonal ceremonies. Archaeological survey has identified multiple stone alignments oriented towards significant celestial events, suggesting systematic observation of astronomical phenomena by trained specialists. The sacred geography of Celtic lands reveals sophisticated understanding of landscape organisation that integrated natural features with human-constructed ritual spaces. This system required extensive coordination by religious specialists who maintained knowledge of proper site locations, ceremonial protocols, and seasonal timing for different types of religious activity. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that Druids functioned as the institutional framework that organised and maintained this complex sacred landscape across the Celtic world. The institutional structure that governed Celtic religious and intellectual life reveals a sophisticated hierarchy that extended far beyond the simple priest-warrior-farmer divisions familiar from other Indo-European societies. Archaeological evidence combined with classical sources and later Celtic literary traditions demonstrates that Druidic organisation comprised three distinct but interconnected orders, each with specialised functions, educational requirements, and social responsibilities that collectively maintain the complex fabric of Celtic civilization. At the apex of this system stood the Druids proper, whose primary functions encompassed judicial authority, advanced education, and diplomatic mediation between tribal groups. These figures wielded extraordinary power within Celtic society, serving as supreme arbiters in legal disputes that range from property boundaries to accusations of murder. Their judicial authority transcended tribal loyalties, enabling them to resolve conflicts between different Celtic communities and maintain legal consistency across geographically dispersed populations. The uniform legal terminology preserved in early Irish and Welsh law texts demonstrates the effectiveness of this system in transmitting complex jurisprudential concepts across vast distances and extended time periods. The educational responsibilities of the Druids proper involved training the next generation of religious specialists in the most advanced aspects of Celtic intellectual tradition. This instruction covered natural philosophy, astronomical observation, theological doctrine, and the intricate legal precedents that governed Celtic society. Students seeking admission to this highest level of Druidic education had typically already completed extensive preliminary training in memorization techniques basic legal principles and fundamental religious concepts. The 20-year educational period Caesar describes likely represents the total duration required to achieve full Druidic status, beginning with elementary instruction and culminating in mastery of the most esoteric teachings. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Hochdorf burial and the Vix tomb reveals the material wealth and social prestige associated with the highest levels of Druidic authority. The grave goods accompanying these elite burials include imported luxury items from across Europe and the Mediterranean, indicating that senior Druids commanded extensive trade networks and accumulated substantial economic resources. The presence of specialized craftwork, including intricate metalwork and exotic materials, suggests that Druidic institutions supported communities of skilled artisans who produced the ceremonial objects required for religious rituals. The second tier of the Druidic hierarchy consisted of the bards, whose specialized functions centered on the preservation and performance of historical narratives, genealogical records, and poetic compositions that encoded legal and religious knowledge within memorable, artistic forms. These figures served as the primary repositories of Celtic cultural memory, maintaining vast collections of oral literature that preserved tribal histories, mythological traditions, and legal precedents spanning multiple generations. Their training emphasized verbal artistry, musical composition, and the complex metrical systems that facilitated accurate memorization of extended narrative sequences. Bardic education involved mastery of multiple poetic forms, each suited to different social occasions and communicative purposes. Praise poetry celebrating the achievements of warriors and rulers required intimate knowledge of military tactics, genealogical connections, and the specific deeds that merited commemoration. Satirical compositions, which Celtic tradition credited with supernatural power to cause physical harm to their targets, demanded understanding of social relationships and political tensions that could be exploited through verbal attack. Legal poetry encoded complex jurisprudential principles within metrical frameworks that enabled precise transmission of technical terminology across generations of oral tradition. The social functions of bards extended beyond mere entertainment to encompass crucial roles in political legitimization and social cohesion. Their genealogical knowledge validated the claims of rulers to legitimate authority by tracing royal lineages back to divine or semi-divine ancestors. During succession disputes, bardic testimony regarding bloodline connections could determine the outcome of political conflicts, making these figures essential participants in the power structures of Celtic society. Their presence at royal courts provided rulers with both ceremonial validation and practical advice based on historical precedent and traditional wisdom. Archaeological evidence for bardic activities appears in the form of specialized musical instruments and performance spaces discovered at high-status Celtic sites. The Deskford Carnix, a bronze war trumpet decorated with elaborate boar's head terminals, demonstrates the sophisticated musical technology available to Celtic performers. Similar instruments discovered across Celtic Europe reveal standardized construction techniques and decorative motifs that suggest coordinated production by specialized craftsmen working according to established artistic traditions. Performance spaces within Celtic settlements show evidence of acoustic considerations and audience arrangements that facilitated bardic presentations. The amphitheatre-like arrangements discovered at some hillfoot sites provided natural acoustics that enabled single performers to address large audiences without amplification. The positioning of these spaces within settlement layouts indicates their integration into the regular social activities of Celtic communities, suggesting that bardic performances occurred frequently rather than only during special occasions. The third component of the Druidic hierarchy comprised the Vates, whose specialized knowledge encompassed divination, healing practices, and the interpretation of natural omens that guided both individual decisions and community policies. These figures possessed extensive understanding of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and the astronomical observations that determined auspicious timing for various undertakings. Their medical knowledge combined empirical observation of plant properties with theoretical frameworks derived from Celtic concepts of cosmic harmony and divine intervention in human affairs. The divinatory practices of the Vates involved multiple techniques for obtaining supernatural guidance regarding future events and appropriate courses of action. Classical sources describe various methods, including the observation of bird flight patterns, the interpretation of animal entrails, and the casting of wooden lots marked with symbolic designs. Archaeological discoveries of divination equipment, including sets of marked bones and specialized containers for ritual casting, confirm the material culture associated with these practices. Healing sanctuaries throughout Celtic territories provide extensive evidence for the medical knowledge and therapeutic practices maintained by the Vates. The sanctuary of Sequana at the source of the Seine yielded thousands of anatomical votive offerings representing specific body parts that pilgrims sought to heal through divine intervention. The accuracy of these anatomical representations demonstrates detailed knowledge of human anatomy that could only be acquired through systematic study and practical experience with medical conditions. The wooden sculptures discovered at Sequana include representations of internal organs, limbs affected by specific diseases, and complete human figures showing various pathological conditions. The precision of these carvings indicates that Celtic medical practitioners possessed sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and pathology that enabled accurate diagnosis and targeted treatment of specific ailments. The standardized artistic conventions employed in these votives suggest institutional oversight by trained specialists who maintained consistent standards for medical representation. Herbal medicine formed a crucial component of Vatic medical practice, as evidenced by the botanical knowledge preserved in later Celtic literary traditions and confirmed by archaeological discoveries of medicinal plants at religious sites. The systematic organization of this knowledge, including detailed information about plant identification, preparation methods, and therapeutic applications, required extensive training that could only be provided by experienced practitioners familiar with both theoretical principles and practical techniques. The integration of astronomical observation with medical practice reflects the sophisticated theoretical framework underlying Celtic healing traditions. The timing of herbal collection, the scheduling of surgical procedures, and the administration of therapeutic treatments were all coordinated with celestial observations that determined optimal conditions for different medical interventions. This integration of empirical medical knowledge with astronomical timing demonstrates the systematic approach Celtic practitioners brought to healthcare delivery. The educational system that prepared individuals for roles within the Druidic hierarchy represents one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of ancient European civilization. The 20-year training period Caesar describes involved progressive advancement through increasingly specialized levels of instruction, beginning with basic memorization techniques and fundamental religious concepts before advancing to the most esoteric aspects of Celtic intellectual tradition. This extended educational process produced specialists whose knowledge encompassed law, medicine, astronomy, theology, history, and natural philosophy within integrated theoretical frameworks. The prohibition against written records that Caesar notes served multiple functions within the Druidic educational system. By requiring students to memorize vast quantities of information, rather than relying on written texts, the system strengthened memory capacity and ensured that graduates possessed immediate access to their knowledge without dependence on external resources. The oral transmission of knowledge also maintained strict control over access to specialized information, preventing unauthorized individuals from acquiring religious or legal knowledge that could be misused for personal advantage. The memorization techniques employed in Druidic education involved sophisticated mnemonic systems that encoded complex information within memorable poetic and narrative frameworks. Legal principles were embedded within mythological stories that illustrated their practical application, while astronomical data was preserved within seasonal narratives that connected celestial observations with agricultural activities and religious ceremonies. This integration of practical knowledge with memorable artistic forms enabled accurate transmission of technical information across multiple generations of oral tradition. The geographical scope of Druidic education created intellectual networks that transcended political boundaries and tribal loyalties throughout the Celtic world. Students travelled from distant territories to study at renowned educational centres, creating personal connections that facilitated communication and coordination between geographically separated Celtic communities. These educational networks enabled the maintenance of consistent legal and religious traditions across the vast expanse of Celtic settlement from Ireland to Asia Minor. The curriculum of advanced Druidic education encompassed natural philosophy that addressed fundamental questions about the structure of the universe, the nature of divine powers, and the relationship between human society and cosmic order. This instruction included detailed astronomical observation that enabled accurate calendar construction, eclipse prediction, and the determination of optimal timing for various activities. The mathematical knowledge required for these calculations demonstrates the sophisticated intellectual capabilities developed within Druidic educational institutions. Gender roles within Druidic society present complex patterns that defy simple categorization according to modern expectations about ancient gender restrictions. Classical sources provide limited but significant references to female religious specialists who exercised authority within Celtic religious institutions, while archaeological evidence reveals women occupying high-status positions that may have been connected to religious functions. The integration of this evidence with later Celtic literary traditions suggests that women participated in Druidic activities across multiple levels of the institutional hierarchy. The Vix burial in Burgundy provides the most spectacular archaeological evidence for high-status women in Celtic society who may have held religious authority. The massive bronze crater discovered in this 6th century BC burial, capable of holding over 1,000 litres of liquid, represents one of the largest metal vessels known from the ancient world. The burial's position commanding extensive territorial views and its proximity to major hill fort complexes suggest that the interred woman wielded significant political and possibly religious authority within her community. Additional female burials throughout Celtic Europe reveal patterns of grave goods and burial treatment that indicate specialized roles possibly connected to religious functions. The Rheinheim burial in Germany contained a woman accompanied by elaborate jewellery, imported luxury goods, and specialized equipment that may have been used for divination or ceremonial purposes. The quality and variety of these grave goods indicate that high-status Celtic women could accumulate substantial wealth and social prestige through their specialized activities. Classical references to female Druids appear in later Roman sources that describe women serving as priestesses, prophets, and advisors to political leaders. Tacitus mentions women participating in the defence of Mona alongside male Druids, suggesting that female religious specialists shared in the political and military aspects of Druidic resistance to Roman conquest. These references, while limited, indicate that women could achieve positions of religious authority that enabled them to participate in the highest levels of Celtic political activity. The archaeological evidence from healing sanctuaries suggests that women may have played particularly important roles as medical practitioners within the Vatic order. The anatomical votives discovered at sites like Sequana include numerous representations of female reproductive organs and conditions specific to women's health, indicating specialized knowledge of gynecological medicine that was likely maintained by female practitioners. The precision and detail of these representations suggests systematic study of women's medical conditions by specialists familiar with female anatomy and reproductive health. Irish literary traditions preserve extensive evidence for female religious specialists who exercised significant authority within pre-Christian Celtic society. The figure of the Bandrui, or female druid, appears frequently in medieval Irish texts as a powerful practitioner of magic, prophecy and healing, who could influence the outcomes of battles and political conflicts. While these sources date to the medieval period, their consistent portrayal of female religious authority suggests the preservation of ancient traditions regarding women's roles within Druidic institutions. The social status of Druids within Celtic society reflected their essential functions as mediators between human communities and divine powers, arbiters of legal disputes, and guardians of cultural traditions that maintained social cohesion across tribal boundaries. Their exemption from military service and taxation, as noted by Caesar, elevated them above the warrior aristocracy in certain respects, while acknowledging their specialized contributions to community welfare. This privileged status enabled Druids to accumulate substantial wealth, maintain extensive educational institutions, and exercise political influence that extended across tribal territories. The advisory relationships between Druids and Celtic rulers created complex dynamics that balanced royal authority with religious oversight of political decisions. Kings and tribal leaders relied on Druidic knowledge of legal precedent, astronomical timing, and divine will to guide their policy decisions and validate their authority to rule. This dependence on Druidic expertise provided religious specialists with significant influence over political affairs while maintaining the theoretical supremacy of secular rulers in military and administrative matters. The diplomatic functions of Druids enabled them to serve as neutral mediators in conflicts between different tribal groups, facilitating negotiations and treaty arrangements that might otherwise have been impossible due to traditional enmities and competing territorial claims. Their religious authority transcended political boundaries, enabling them to invoke supernatural sanctions against treaty violations and provide credible guarantees for negotiated agreements. This diplomatic role required extensive knowledge of legal traditions, genealogical relationships, and territorial boundaries that could only be maintained through systematic education and institutional memory. The fundamental architecture of Celtic religious thought rested upon a sophisticated understanding of existence that transcended the simple binary of life and death, familiar in many ancient cultures. Archaeological evidence from Celtic burial sites across Europe reveals consistent patterns of grave goods, body positioning, and tomb construction that reflect deeply held beliefs about the soul's continuation beyond physical death. The Hochdorf burial in southwestern Germany, dating to the 6th century BC, exemplifies this worldview through its elaborate preparation of the deceased for an afterlife journey that would require the same material necessities as earthly existence. The burial chamber at Hochdorf contained not merely personal possessions, but an entire household's worth of equipment, arranged with meticulous attention to functional accessibility. Bronze vessels for drinking, cauldrons for food preparation, and even a four-wheeled wagon positioned near the burial couch suggest that the deceased was expected to maintain the same social status and daily activities in the afterlife as he had enjoyed in life. The presence of mead residues in drinking horns and evidence of fermented beverages in bronze containers indicates that Celtic concepts of post-mortem existence included sensory experiences identical to those of living humans. The orientation of Celtic burials provides crucial insights into beliefs about the soul's journey after death. Across different regions and time periods, Celtic graves consistently face westward toward the setting sun, suggesting that the deceased were expected to follow solar pathways into otherworldly realms. The Vix burial in Burgundy demonstrates this pattern while adding complexity through its positioning on elevated terrain that commanded extensive territorial views. This placement suggests that high-status individuals were expected to maintain protective oversight of their earthly territories even after death. The concept of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls between different forms of existence, appears consistently in classical sources describing Celtic beliefs, and finds confirmation in archaeological evidence from ritual sites throughout Celtic territories. Caesar's account of Druidic teaching regarding the immortality of souls and their passage after death to other bodies reflects sophisticated theological concepts that integrated individual survival with cosmic cycles of death and renewal. The systematic nature of weapon deposits at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde, where thousands of items were ritually destroyed before deposition, suggests ceremonies designed to transfer objects from the material world to otherworldly realms where they could serve new purposes. The ritual destruction of valuable objects before their deposition in sacred contexts reflects beliefs about the transformation necessary for material goods to function in otherworldly realms. At Le Ten on Lake Neuchâtel, the massive deposits of weapons, tools and ornaments show consistent patterns of deliberate damage that rendered them useless for earthly purposes while presumably preparing them for otherworldly service. The precision of this destruction, involving specific bending and breaking techniques applied to different categories of objects, indicates established protocols that required specialized knowledge to execute properly. Animal sacrifice practices throughout Celtic territories reveal additional dimensions of beliefs about soul transmigration and otherworldly existence. The systematic butchering patterns discovered at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde demonstrate careful separation of different anatomical elements according to specific ritual requirements. Skulls were treated differently from postcranial remains, while certain bones were arranged in geometric patterns that may have encoded theological concepts about the relationship between physical and spiritual aspects of existence. The treatment of human remains at Celtic ritual sites provides the most direct evidence for beliefs about soul survival and otherworldly journey requirements. At Ribemont-sur-Ancre, the massive ossuary containing over 1,000 individuals arranged in precise anatomical groupings reflect systematic concepts about post-mortem existence that required specific preparation of physical remains. The separation of skulls from other skeletal elements and their placement in distinct areas suggests beliefs about different aspects of human identity that required separate treatment for successful otherworldly transition. The geographical conception of otherworldly realms within Celtic cosmology reveals sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships that connected earthly territories with supernatural domains through specific landscape features and seasonal transitions. The Welsh concept of Annwn and the Irish Tir na Nog represent parallel traditions describing otherworldly realms that existed in complex relationship with the physical world rather than simple opposition to it. These domains were accessible through particular geographical locations and during specific temporal conditions that required specialized knowledge to navigate safely. The identification of thin places or locations where the boundary between worlds became permeable created a sacred geography that integrated otherworldly access points with territorial organization and seasonal ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from sites like Newgrange in Ireland demonstrates how passage tombs were positioned to capture specific astronomical events that marked periods of increased otherworldly accessibility. The winter solstice alignment at Newgrange, where sunlight penetrates the burial chamber only during the shortest days of the year, suggests systematic coordination between celestial observations and beliefs about otherworldly communication. Sacred springs throughout Celtic territories functioned as crucial interfaces between earthly and otherworldly realms, providing locations where humans could communicate with supernatural beings and deposit offerings intended for otherworldly recipients. The therapeutic springs at Bath, dedicated to the goddess Sulis, attracted pilgrims who sought healing through direct contact with otherworldly powers accessible through the naturally heated waters. The thousands of curse tablets deposited in the spring reveal sophisticated understanding of legal procedures that operated across worldly boundaries, enabling human supplicants to seek otherworldly intervention in earthly disputes. The seasonal festivals that structured Celtic religious calendars created temporal thin places when otherworldly beings could more easily interact with human communities. Samhain, marking the transition from the light half to the dark half of the year, represented the most significant of these temporal boundaries when the dead could return to visit their earthly homes, and supernatural beings could move freely through human territories. Archaeological evidence from Celtic settlements shows increased ritual activity during late October and early November, including special food preparations and the lighting of ceremonial fires that may have served as beacons for otherworldly visitors. The polytheistic framework of Celtic religion encompassed hundreds of deities whose functions range from universal cosmic principles to highly localized territorial spirits. This theological complexity required extensive systematization by religious specialists who maintained knowledge of proper invocations, seasonal ceremonies, and territorial boundaries that defined different divine jurisdictions. The consistency of certain divine names across geographically separated Celtic regions indicates successful transmission of theological knowledge through networks of trained specialists who coordinated religious practices across tribal boundaries. Cernunnos, the horned god, whose image appears on the Gundestrup cauldron and numerous other Celtic artefacts, represents one of the most widely recognised deities in the Celtic pantheon. His iconography consistently associates him with wild animals, particularly stags, and with symbols of abundance including torques and bags of grain. Archaeological discoveries of Cernunnos imagery from Scotland to Romania demonstrate the geographical extent of his worship while revealing regional variations that reflect local adaptation of universal divine concepts. The Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in a Danish bog but clearly of Celtic manufacture, provides exceptional insight into the complex iconography associated with Cernunnos worship. The deity appears in a cross-legged meditation posture, grasping a torque in one hand and a ram-headed serpent in the other, surrounded by various animals including stags, boars and bulls. This imagery suggests concepts of divine lordship over the natural world that required human intermediaries to maintain proper relationships between human communities and wild animal populations. Regional variations in Cernunnos imagery reveal how universal divine concepts were adapted to local, geographical and cultural conditions. In Britain, the deity often appears associated with coins and symbols of material prosperity, reflecting the economic concerns of communities engaged in extensive trade networks. Continental examples more frequently emphasize his connection to forest environments and wild animal populations, suggesting adaptation to different ecological contexts and subsistence strategies. Brigid represents another major Celtic deity whose worship extended across the entire Celtic world while maintaining consistent associations with craftsmanship, healing, and poetic inspiration. Archaeological evidence for Brigid worship appears in the form of specialized workshops, healing sanctuaries, and educational centers that may have been dedicated to her patronage. The goddess's triple nature, encompassing smithcraft, healing, and poetry, reflects the integration of practical skills with supernatural inspiration that characterized Celtic approaches to specialized knowledge. The sanctuary of Brigid at Kildare in Ireland provides exceptional evidence for the institutional structures associated with major Celtic deities. Medieval sources describe an eternal flame maintained by a community of religious specialists who preserved ancient ceremonial traditions through the Christian period. Archaeological investigation of the site has revealed evidence for continuous religious activity spanning over a millennium, including metalworking facilities, healing springs, and educational buildings that supported communities of specialized practitioners. Metalworking sites throughout Celtic territories show consistent associations with religious activity that suggests divine patronage of craftwork requiring specialized knowledge and supernatural inspiration. The Latin artistic style that characterizes Celtic metalwork demonstrates sophisticated understanding of geometric principles, symbolic systems, and technical procedures that required extensive training to master. The consistency of artistic motifs across vast geographical distances indicates institutional oversight by religious specialists who maintain standards for sacred art production. Lugh, the multi-skilled deity associated with craftsmanship, warfare, and kingship, appears throughout Celtic territories in various forms that reflect his role as patron of specialised knowledge and political authority. The festival of Lugnasad, celebrated on August 1st, marked the beginning of harvest season with ceremonies that combined agricultural thanksgiving with demonstrations of craftsmanship and athletic competition. Archaeological evidence from hilltop sites across Celtic Europe reveals increased activity during late summer that may reflect Lugnasad celebrations requiring coordination by religious specialists. The Coligny calendar, discovered in France and dating to the 1st century BC, provides exceptional evidence for the astronomical knowledge required to coordinate seasonal festivals with celestial observations. This bronze tablet contains a complex lunar-solar calendar system that synchronized lunar months with the solar year through sophisticated intercalation procedures. The technical terminology employed in the calendar demonstrates systematic astronomical observation that could only be maintained by trained specialists familiar with mathematical calculation and long-term celestial cycles. Regional deities throughout Celtic territories reflect the localized nature of much Celtic religious practice, while demonstrating how universal divine concepts were adapted to specific geographical and cultural contexts. The goddess Sequana, associated with the source of the Seine River, attracted pilgrims from across Gaul who sought healing through contact with her sacred waters. The thousands of votive offerings discovered at her sanctuary reveal systematic approaches to divine petition that required knowledge of proper offering types, ceremonial procedures, and seasonal timing for different categories of requests. Territorial deities associated with specific landscapes, rivers, and tribal boundaries required specialized knowledge of local traditions, genealogical connections, and historical precedents that validated divine claims to particular geographical areas. The integration of these local traditions with broader Celtic theological frameworks demanded extensive coordination by religious specialists who could maintain consistency between universal principles and regional variations in divine worship. The sacred calendar that structured Celtic religious observances reveals sophisticated integration of astronomical observation with agricultural cycles and theological concepts about seasonal transitions between different cosmic conditions. The four major festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad divided the year into quarters that corresponded to crucial transitions in both agricultural and pastoral activities. These celebrations required extensive preparation, including special food production, ceremonial equipment preparation, and coordination of community participation that could only be managed by trained specialists. Samhain, celebrated on October 31st and November 1st, mark the most significant transition in the Celtic year, when the boundary between worlds became most permeable and the dead could return to visit their earthly homes. Archaeological evidence from Celtic settlements shows increased ritual activity during this period, including the preparation of special foods, the lighting of ceremonial fires, and the performance of divination ceremonies designed to obtain supernatural guidance for the coming dark season. The astronomical alignments discovered at Celtic ritual sites demonstrate systematic observation of celestial events that enabled accurate timing of seasonal festivals and coordination of religious activities across geographically separated communities. Stone circles throughout Britain and Ireland show consistent orientations towards significant solar and lunar events, including solstices, equinoxes, and major lunar standstills that occur at 18.6-year intervals. The precision of these alignments required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation that could only be maintained by dedicated specialists. Imbolc, celebrated on February 1st and 2nd, marked the beginning of the agricultural year with ceremonies focused on purification, renewal, and preparation for spring planting. The festival's association with Brigid reflects her patronage of activities requiring specialized knowledge, including metalworking, healing, and agricultural innovation. Archaeological evidence from Celtic farmsteads shows increased activity during early February that may reflect Imbolc preparations requiring coordination between agricultural and religious specialists. Beltane, celebrated on April 30th and May 1st, mark the transition to the light half of the year with ceremonies emphasizing fertility, protection, and the renewal of contracts between human communities and supernatural powers. The lighting of ceremonial fires on hilltops throughout Celtic territories created networks of communication that coordinated festival celebrations across vast geographical areas. These fire ceremonies required specialized knowledge of proper fuel types, ignition procedures, and astronomical timing that could only be provided by trained religious specialists. Lugnasad, celebrated on August 1st, combined harvest thanksgiving with demonstrations of craftsmanship, athletic competition, and legal proceedings that required coordination by multiple categories of specialists. The festival's association with Lu reflects his patronage of activities requiring specialized knowledge and political authority. Archaeological evidence from hilltop sites throughout Celtic Europe reveals temporary structures, craft production areas, and assembly spaces that supported large gatherings during late summer periods. The lunar bases of Celtic calendar systems required sophisticated mathematical knowledge to coordinate monthly cycles with seasonal festivals and agricultural activities. The Coligny calendar demonstrates mastery of intercalation procedures that maintained synchronization between lunar months and the solar year over extended periods. The complexity of these calculations required institutional memory spanning multiple generations of trained specialists who could maintain accuracy through systematic observation and mathematical computation. The rhythmic beating of bronze-tipped spears against wooden shields echoed across the hillsides of Gaul as Celtic communities prepared for Samhain, the most significant festival in their sacred calendar. Archaeological excavations at Oppida throughout Europe have revealed extensive evidence for the elaborate preparations these seasonal celebrations required, including specialized cooking facilities, temporary structures for housing visitors, and carefully arranged deposits of ceremonial objects that would be destroyed during the festivities. The coordination of these massive community gatherings demanded sophisticated organizational capabilities that could only be provided by trained religious specialists who understood both the practical logistics and spiritual requirements of seasonal ceremonies. The four major festivals that structured the Celtic year, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad, represented far more than simple agricultural markers or religious observances. These celebrations functioned as crucial mechanisms for social cohesion, economic exchange, and political negotiation that brought together communities from across tribal territories. The timing of these festivals, determined through careful astronomical observation, required coordination between multiple categories of specialists, including astronomers who calculated optimal dates, legal experts who supervised contract negotiations, and religious authorities who ensured proper ceremonial protocols were observed. Samhain, celebrated during the transition from October to November, marked the beginning of the dark half of the year when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead became most permeable. Archaeological evidence from Celtic settlements shows dramatic increases in ritual activity during this period, including the slaughter of livestock for winter preservation, the brewing of ceremonial beverages, and the preparation of special foods that would sustain communities through the approaching cold season. The Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire, reveals extensive evidence for Samhain preparations, including large-scale grain processing, the construction of temporary storage facilities, and the organisation of massive communal feasts that could accommodate hundreds of participants. The practical aspects of Samhain celebrations required months of advanced preparation, coordinated by specialists who understood both agricultural timing and religious requirements. Cattle and sheep designated for winter slaughter had to be selected according to specific criteria that balanced nutritional needs with ritual appropriateness. The animals chosen for ceremonial sacrifice required particular physical characteristics and genealogical backgrounds that qualified them for divine offering. Archaeological analysis of animal bones from Celtic sites reveals systematic selection patterns that indicate specialised knowledge of livestock breeding and religious protocols governing animal sacrifice. The brewing of ceremonial beverages for Samhain festivities involved complex fermentation processes that required precise timing and specialised equipment. Archaeological discoveries at the Hochdorf burial site included bronze cauldrons with residues of fermented honey beverages, while similar vessels from sites across Celtic Europe contain evidence for various alcoholic drinks, including barley beer, fruit wines, and herb-infused spirits. The production of these beverages in quantities sufficient for major festivals demanded coordination between agricultural specialists who grew the necessary ingredients and brewing experts who understood fermentation chemistry and seasonal timing. The divination ceremonies that formed central components of Samhain observances required extensive preparation of specialised equipment and careful training of participants in proper interpretation techniques. Archaeological discoveries of divination sets from Celtic sites include collections of marked bones, carved wooden lots, and bronze implements designed for specific fortune-telling procedures. The Colchester divination set, discovered in a 1st century BC burial, contained over 30 individual pieces including dice-like objects marked with various symbols, small bronze figurines representing different categories of supernatural beings, and containers designed for the ritual casting of lots. The interpretation of divination results demanded extensive knowledge of symbolic systems, mythological references, and legal precedents that could only be acquired through years of specialised training. The consistency of divinatory symbols across geographically separated Celtic sites suggests standardised educational curricula that transmitted interpretive knowledge through networks of trained specialists. Bone dice discovered at sites from Scotland to Spain show identical marking systems and manufacturing techniques that indicate coordinated production by craftsmen working according to established religious specifications. Imbolc, celebrated at the beginning of February, focused on purification rituals and preparation for the agricultural year that required coordination between religious specialists and farming communities. The festival's association with Brigid, the goddess of smithcraft, healing and poetry, reflects the integration of practical skills with supernatural inspiration that characterised Celtic approaches to specialised knowledge. Archaeological evidence from sites dedicated to Brigid worship reveals workshops, healing facilities, and educational centres that supported communities of practitioners who maintained her ceremonial traditions. The purification ceremonies central to Imbolc observances involved the ritual cleansing of agricultural tools, livestock, and human participants through contact with specially prepared waters and ceremonial fires. The sacred wells at Bath and other healing sanctuaries show evidence of increased activity during early February, including deposits of votive offerings and the performance of healing rituals that combined practical medicine with supernatural intervention. The preparation of purification waters required knowledge of specific herbs, minerals, and ceremonial procedures that could only be provided by trained specialists familiar with both botanical properties and religious protocols. The blessing of agricultural implements during Imbolc ceremonies ensured divine protection for the coming planting season, while providing opportunities for technical instruction in improved farming methods. Archaeological discoveries of Iron Age farming tools show evidence of ritual modification, including the addition of protective symbols, the incorporation of blessed metals, and the application of ceremonial treatments designed to enhance their effectiveness. The coordination of these blessing ceremonies required cooperation between religious specialists who understood divine requirements and craftsmen who possessed technical knowledge of tool construction and maintenance. Beltane, celebrated at the beginning of May, mark the transition to the light half of the year with ceremonies emphasizing fertility, protection, and renewal of contracts between human communities and supernatural powers. The lighting of ceremonial fires on hilltops throughout Celtic territories created networks of visual communication that coordinated festival celebrations across vast geographical areas. Archaeological investigation of Beltane fire sites reveals carefully constructed hearths positioned for maximum visibility, specialized fuel preparations, and systematic arrangements of stones that may have served astronomical alignment functions. The fire-lighting ceremonies that initiated Beltane celebrations required precise timing coordinated with astronomical observations and careful preparation of ceremonial materials. All existing fires within the community were extinguished before the festival began, ensuring that the new Beltane fire would serve as the sole source of flame for relighting household hearths and ceremonial torches. This procedure demanded coordination by religious specialists who understood both the practical logistics of fire management and the spiritual significance of flame renewal ceremonies. The selection and preparation of Beltane fire fuel involved specialized knowledge of wood properties, burning characteristics, and symbolic associations that qualified different tree species for ceremonial use. Oak wood, sacred to Celtic deities and prized for its long-burning qualities, formed the primary fuel for major ceremonial fires. Hawthorn branches, gathered according to specific protocols and blessed through appropriate rituals, provided kindling that carried particular protective properties. The systematic collection and preparation of these materials required coordination between botanical specialists who understood tree identification and religious experts who knew proper harvesting ceremonies. Lughnasadh, celebrated at the beginning of August, combined harvest thanksgiving with demonstrations of craftsmanship, athletic competition, and legal proceedings that brought together specialists from across Celtic society. The festival's association with Lugh, the multi-skilled deity of craftsmanship and kingship, reflects the integration of practical abilities with divine inspiration that characterized Celtic concepts of specialized knowledge. Archaeological evidence from hilltop assembly sites throughout Europe reveals temporary structures, craft production areas, and competition venues that supported large gatherings during late summer periods. The craft demonstrations that formed central components of Lughnasadh celebrations provided opportunities for specialists to display their skills, share technical knowledge, and compete for recognition within their professional communities. Metalworkers brought examples of their finest weapons, tools, and ornaments to demonstrate mastery of complex manufacturing techniques. Textile producers displayed elaborately woven fabrics that showcased their understanding of dyeing processes, pattern construction, and decorative applications. These demonstrations served both educational and competitive functions, enabling the transmission of technical knowledge while establishing hierarchies of skill within specialized crafts. The athletic competitions associated with Lughnasadh required extensive organization by specialists who understood both the practical requirements of different contests and their symbolic significance within Celtic culture. Horse racing events demanded knowledge of breeding techniques, training methods, and track construction that could only be provided by equestrian experts. Wrestling and boxing competitions required referees familiar with traditional rules and scoring systems. Chariot racing, the most prestigious of Celtic sports, involved complex technical knowledge of vehicle construction, horse handling, and racing strategies that represented the pinnacle of Celtic athletic achievement. The legal proceedings conducted during Lughnasadh assemblies provided opportunities for dispute resolution. contract negotiation, and law revision that required coordination by legal specialists familiar with traditional precedents and contemporary needs. The temporary nature of these legal sessions demanded portable record-keeping systems and memorization techniques that enabled accurate preservation of decisions and agreements. Archaeological discoveries of legal paraphernalia from Celtic sites include measuring devices, scales for weighing precious metals, and symbolic objects used in oath-taking ceremonies. The question of human sacrifice within Celtic religious practice remains one of the most controversial aspects of Druidic ritual activities, with classical sources providing dramatic accounts that must be carefully evaluated against archaeological evidence and scholarly analysis. Caesar's descriptions of mass human sacrifice, including the construction of enormous wicker figures filled with living victims, represent some of the most sensational claims about Celtic religious practices. However, these accounts must be examined within the context of Roman political propaganda and cultural prejudices that routinely portrayed non-Roman peoples as practitioners of barbaric customs that justified military intervention. Archaeological evidence for human sacrifice in Celtic contexts does exist, but the scale and systematic nature described by classical authors appear significantly exaggerated. Bog bodies discovered across northern Europe provide clear evidence that ritual human sacrifice occurred within Celtic religious practice, but these isolated discoveries hardly support claims of widespread routine mass sacrifice. The Lindo Man, discovered in a Cheshire bog and dating to the 1st century AD, shows evidence of ritual killing including a garrote around the neck, blunt force trauma to the head, and a slit throat that suggests ceremonial execution according to specific protocols. The forensic analysis of bog bodies reveals sophisticated understanding of ritual killing procedures that required specialized knowledge to execute properly. The Graubal Man, discovered in Denmark and dating to the 3rd century BC, shows evidence of careful preparation including ritual shaving and the consumption of specific foods before death. The preservation conditions in peat bogs have maintained stomach contents that reveal final meals consisting of grains, seeds, and herbs that may have held ritual significance. These discoveries suggest that human sacrifice, when it occurred, followed established protocols that required training and religious authority to implement correctly. The interpretation of archaeological evidence for human sacrifice must consider alternative explanations, including judicial execution, warfare casualties, and accidental deaths that might produce similar physical evidence. The concentration of bog body discoveries in areas of Celtic settlement does suggest cultural practices that involved the deliberate deposition of human remains in watery environments, but the specific circumstances of individual deaths remain difficult to determine from archaeological evidence alone. The ritual treatment of some bog bodies, including the careful positioning of remains and the inclusion of personal objects, indicates ceremonial rather than casual disposal of corpses. Divination practices formed essential components of Celtic religious activities that required extensive training in observation techniques, symbolic interpretation, and communication with supernatural powers. The methods employed by Celtic diviners encompassed multiple approaches to obtaining supernatural guidance, including the observation of natural phenomena, the interpretation of animal behaviour, and the casting of specially prepared lots or dice. Archaeological discoveries of divination equipment from Celtic sites reveal sophisticated understanding of probability, symbolic systems, and ritual procedures that enabled systematic approaches to fortune-telling activities. Augury, the interpretation of bird flight patterns and behaviour, represented one of the most prestigious forms of Celtic divination that required extensive knowledge of avian species, seasonal migration patterns, and behavioural indicators that revealed supernatural messages. The training required for competent augury practice involved years of field observation, memorization of interpretive precedents, and understanding of symbolic associations between different bird species and categories of divine communication. The consistency of augural interpretations across Celtic territories suggests standardized educational curricula that transmitted this specialized knowledge through networks of trained practitioners. The observation techniques employed in Celtic augury involved systematic attention to multiple variables including flight directions, flock formations, calling patterns, and behavioural anomalies that might indicate supernatural intervention in natural processes. The positioning of observation points at specific locations within sacred landscapes enabled augurs to conduct their observations under optimal conditions while maintaining proper ritual protocols. Archaeological investigation of hilltop sites throughout Celtic Europe has revealed circular stone arrangements that may have served as augural observation platforms positioned for maximum visibility of sky phenomena. Scrying, the practice of divination through observation of reflective surfaces including water, polished metal, and crystal formations, required specialized equipment and controlled environmental conditions that enabled practitioners to perceive supernatural visions. Archaeological discoveries of scrying mirrors from Celtic sites include polished bronze discs, silver-backed glass surfaces, and naturally occurring crystal formations that were modified for divinatory use. The preparation and maintenance of scrying equipment required technical knowledge of metallurgy, optics, and surface treatment that could only be acquired through specialized training. The interpretation of scrying visions demanded extensive knowledge of symbolic systems, mythological references, and personal psychology that enabled practitioners to translate ambiguous visual impressions into coherent, prophetic messages. The training required for competent scrying practice involved meditation techniques, memory exercises, and systematic study of interpretive frameworks that provided structure for understanding supernatural communications. The consistency of scrying symbolism across Celtic territories suggests coordinated educational systems that transmitted interpretive knowledge through established institutional networks. Healing practices within Celtic society integrated herbal medicine, surgical procedures, and spiritual intervention through sophisticated theoretical frameworks that combined empirical observation with supernatural causation. The medical knowledge maintained by Celtic healers encompassed detailed understanding of human anatomy, plant pharmacology, and therapeutic procedures that enabled effective treatment of various conditions. Archaeological evidence from healing sanctuaries throughout Celtic Europe reveals the institutional structures that supported medical practice, including specialized facilities, equipment storage, and educational programs for training new practitioners. The herbal medicine traditions maintained by Celtic healers involved extensive botanical knowledge including plant identification, optimal harvesting times, preparation methods, and therapeutic applications that required years of study to master completely. The Druids' reputation for medical expertise, noted by classical authors, reflects systematic approaches to pharmaceutical knowledge that integrated practical experience with theoretical understanding of plant properties and human physiology. Archaeological discoveries of medicinal plants at Celtic sites reveal sophisticated understanding of pharmacological principles that enabled effective treatment of various medical conditions. The surgical capabilities of Celtic medical practitioners included procedures for treating battle wounds, setting broken bones, and performing operations that required detailed anatomical knowledge and technical skill. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from Celtic sites reveals evidence of successful surgical interventions including trepanation procedures, bone setting, and wound treatment that enabled patients to survive serious injuries. The tools discovered at Celtic medical sites include bronze scalpels, bone needles, and specialized instruments designed for specific surgical procedures that demonstrate advanced understanding of medical technology. The integration of spiritual intervention with practical medical treatment reflects Celtic concepts of disease causation that encompassed both physical and supernatural factors requiring coordinated, therapeutic approaches. The healing sanctuaries dedicated to deities like Sulis and Sequana provided locations where medical treatment could be combined with religious ceremonies designed to address supernatural aspects of illness. The votive offerings deposited at these sites include anatomical representations of healed body parts that demonstrate the systematic integration of divine intervention with practical medical care. The therapeutic procedures employed at Celtic healing sanctuaries involved ritual purification, herbal treatment, and ceremonial activities that addressed both physical symptoms and spiritual causes of illness. The preparation of therapeutic waters at sacred springs required knowledge of mineral properties, herbal additives, and ceremonial procedures that enhanced the healing effectiveness of natural resources. The coordination of these therapeutic activities demanded cooperation between medical specialists who understood practical treatment methods and religious experts who could ensure proper spiritual protocols were observed during healing ceremonies. The methodical dismantling of Druidic institutions began not with dramatic military campaigns, but through calculated administrative measures implemented by Roman governors who understood that Celtic resistance drew its organisational strength from religious networks that transcended tribal boundaries. Tiberius, during his reign from 14 to 37 AD, initiated the first systematic restrictions on Druidic activities throughout Gaul, recognising that these religious specialists posed a fundamental threat to Roman administrative control through their ability to coordinate opposition across vast geographical areas and maintain alternative systems of law and justice that competed directly with Roman legal authority. The Tiberian restrictions focused primarily on limiting Druidic judicial functions and preventing the assembly of large religious gatherings that could serve as covers for political organisation. Roman administrators documented instances where Druidic legal decisions contradicted Roman law, creating parallel authority structures that undermined imperial administration. The prohibition of major religious assemblies targeted the annual gatherings at sacred sites like the Conutus territory, where representatives from across the Celtic world had traditionally convened to coordinate religious policy and resolve intertribal disputes. These assemblies had functioned as de facto political conferences that enabled coordinated resistance to Roman rule, while maintaining the appearance of purely religious activities. Archaeological evidence from Gallic Oppida during the Tiberian period reveals gradual changes in material culture that reflect increasing Roman influence over elite Celtic society. The traditional Celtic coinages that had featured indigenous deities and tribal symbols were progressively replaced by Roman-style issues that emphasized imperial authority and Roman religious themes. Excavations at sites like Bibracte show declining evidence for traditional Celtic religious activities during the 20s and 30s AD, including reduced deposits of votive offerings and the abandonment of sacred spaces that had been maintained for centuries. The economic pressures accompanying Tiberian religious restrictions created additional incentives for Celtic elites to abandon traditional practices in favour of Roman alternatives. The lucrative opportunities available through collaboration with Roman administration attracted ambitious individuals who recognised that advancement within the imperial system required demonstration of loyalty to Roman values and rejection of indigenous traditions. The archaeological record from elite Celtic burials during this period shows increasing adoption of Roman burial practices, including cremation rather than inhumation, and the inclusion of Roman luxury goods rather than traditional Celtic prestige objects. Claudius's formal prohibition of Druidism around 54 AD represented a dramatic escalation in Roman suppression efforts that transformed administrative restrictions into outright religious persecution backed by military enforcement. The Claudian edict specifically targeted the practice of Druidism as a barbarous superstition incompatible with Roman civilization, providing legal justification for the arrest and execution of individuals identified as Druidic practitioners. The timing of this prohibition coincided with Claudius's British campaigns, suggesting coordinated efforts to eliminate Druidic influence both in conquered Gaul and in territories targeted for future conquest. The legal framework established by the Claudian prohibition created mechanisms for identifying and prosecuting Druidic practitioners that relied heavily on denunciations by informants seeking rewards or settling personal grievances. Roman administrators established procedures for investigating accusations of Druidic activity that included examination of suspects' knowledge of traditional Celtic lore, their familiarity with astronomical calculations, and their ability to recite lengthy passages of oral tradition. These investigative techniques effectively criminalized the possession of traditional Celtic intellectual knowledge, forcing educated individuals to choose between preserving their cultural heritage and ensuring their personal safety. The enforcement of Claudian anti-Druidic legislation required extensive cooperation between Roman military forces and local collaborators who could identify suspected practitioners and provide testimony regarding their activities. Archaeological evidence from Gallic settlements during the 50s AD shows increased Roman military presence at sites previously associated with Celtic religious activities, including the construction of Roman-style fortifications near traditional sacred groves and the establishment of military posts controlling access to important pilgrimage routes. These security measures effectively disrupted the networks of communication and coordination that had enabled Druidic institutions to maintain their influence across tribal boundaries. The political motivations underlying Roman persecution of Druidism extended beyond simple religious intolerance to encompass strategic concerns about imperial security and administrative efficiency. Roman governors recognized that Druidic institutions provided alternative sources of authority that could challenge imperial control during periods of political instability or military weakness. The ability of Druids to coordinate resistance activities across tribal boundaries posed particular threats during succession crises or frontier wars when Roman military resources were stretched thin. The systematic elimination of these potential opposition leaders represented prudent imperial policy rather than religious fanaticism. The intelligence networks maintained by Druidic institutions posed additional security concerns for Roman administrators who struggled to monitor communications between geographically separated Celtic communities. The annual assemblies and educational exchanges that characterized traditional Druidic organization created opportunities for the transmission of sensitive political information, including Roman military movements, administrative policies, and strategic weaknesses that could be exploited by hostile forces. The disruption of these communication networks through religious persecution served important military objectives that justified the resources devoted to anti-Druidic campaigns. Suetonius Paulinus' appointment as governor of Britain in 58 AD brought to the province a commander specifically chosen for his experience in counter-insurgency operations and his willingness to employ extreme measures against civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance activities. Paulinus had previously served in Mauritania, where he had developed tactics for combating guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain and had demonstrated his ability to coordinate complex military operations across difficult geographical obstacles. His selection for the British command reflected imperial recognition that the conquest of the island would require elimination of the Druidic strongholds that served as centres of organised resistance to Roman rule. The strategic planning for the assault on Mona began with extensive intelligence gathering operations that identified the island's defensive capabilities, population levels, and religious significance within the broader network of British Druidic institutions. Roman agents operating undercover in Celtic communities provided detailed information about the island's fortifications, the number of defenders available, and the seasonal patterns of religious activity that might affect the timing of military operations. This intelligence revealed that Mona served not merely as a religious centre, but as a coordinated military headquarters where resistance leaders from across Britain gathered to plan anti-Roman activities. The logistical preparations for the Mona campaign required solutions to complex problems of amphibious warfare in treacherous tidal waters where conventional Roman naval tactics were inadequate. The Menai Strait presented formidable obstacles, including strong currents, shifting sandbanks, and tidal ranges that could strand vessels or prevent coordinated landings. Roman engineers developed specialized shallow draft vessels capable of navigating these waters while carrying sufficient troops and equipment to establish beachheads against determined resistance. The construction of these vessels required months of preparation, using materials and craftsmen transported from across the Roman Empire. The intelligence reports regarding Mona's defences revealed sophisticated fortification systems that combined natural geographical advantages with constructed barriers designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The island's defenders had constructed wooden palisades along the shoreline, positioned artillery engines at strategic points, and prepared obstacles in the shallow waters that would impede Roman landing craft. These defensive preparations demonstrated military engineering capabilities that reflected coordination by experienced commanders familiar with Roman tactical methods and siege warfare techniques. The Roman assault on Mona in 60 AD unfolded as a carefully orchestrated operation that combined naval landings with psychological warfare designed to overcome the supernatural terror that Celtic defenders hoped to inspire in their attackers. Tacitus's account describes the initial Roman hesitation when confronted by the otherworldly spectacle of white-robed Druids raising their arms to invoke divine curses, while women dressed in funeral garments ran among the defenders, carrying torches and shrieking incantations. This psychological dimension of the battle reflected deliberate Celtic tactics designed to exploit Roman superstitions and religious anxieties that might cause attacking forces to falter at crucial moments. The breakthrough in Roman morale came when Suetonius personally exhorted his troops to overcome their fears and advance against what he characterized as theatrical displays designed to conceal military weakness rather than genuine supernatural powers. The Roman advance, once initiated, proved devastating against defenders who had relied primarily on psychological intimidation rather than conventional military tactics. The superior Roman training, equipment, and tactical coordination overwhelmed Celtic resistance despite the defenders' intimate knowledge of local terrain and their desperate motivation to protect their most sacred religious sites. The systematic destruction that followed the Roman victory on Mona represented deliberate cultural warfare designed to eliminate the institutional foundations of British Druidic resistance. Roman forces cut down the sacred groves where generations of Druids had conducted their most important ceremonies, destroyed the altars where sacrificial rituals had been performed, and burned the libraries of wooden tablets that contained the accumulated wisdom of Celtic intellectual tradition. The archaeological record from Anglesey shows evidence of massive fires during this period, including layers of ash and charcoal that mark the destruction of wooden structures and organic materials associated with religious activities. The discovery of human remains at Druidic sites on Mona provided Roman commanders with propaganda materials that justified their extreme measures against Celtic religious institutions. Tacitus specifically mentions altars soaked with human blood and groves where victims had been hanged, descriptions that supported Roman claims about the barbarous nature of Druidic practices. However, the archaeological evidence for human sacrifice at these sites remains limited and ambiguous, suggesting that Roman accounts may have exaggerated the scale and systematic nature of such practices to justify their comprehensive destruction of Celtic religious institutions. The timing of the Mona assault proved catastrophic for Roman control over eastern Britain, where Boudicca's rebellion erupted while Suetonius's forces were engaged in destroying Druidic strongholds on the distant island. The coordination between these events was not coincidental but reflected careful planning by Celtic resistance leaders who recognized that Roman military resources could not simultaneously suppress uprisings in multiple regions. The Druidic networks that had coordinated this strategic timing demonstrated their continued effectiveness despite years of Roman persecution and their ability to maintain communications across vast geographical distances. Boudica's rebellion revealed the extent to which Druidic institutions had succeeded in organising coordinated resistance to Roman rule throughout Britain. The uprising began among the Iceni following the Roman seizure of tribal lands and the brutal treatment of the royal family, but it quickly spread to other tribes who had been prepared for coordinated action through Druidic networks of communication and organisation. The rebels' ability to coordinate simultaneous attacks on Roman settlements across eastern Britain demonstrated sophisticated planning capabilities that could only have been provided by experienced military and political advisors. The religious dimensions of Boudica's rebellion included specific targeting of Roman religious sites and symbols that reflected Druidic influence over the uprising's strategic objectives. The rebels systematically destroyed Roman temples, defaced imperial statues, and conducted ceremonies that inverted Roman religious practices through deliberate sacrilege, designed to demonstrate the impotence of Roman gods. These actions went beyond simple military objectives to encompass religious warfare that sought to undermine Roman spiritual authority alongside their political and military control. The massacre of Roman civilians at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium involved ritual elements that reflected Druidic concepts of appropriate sacrifice to Celtic deities who had been offended by Roman occupation. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals systematic destruction that followed specific patterns, including the targeting of particular building types, the arrangement of human remains according to ceremonial protocols, and the deposition of Roman objects in ways that suggested ritual rather than random violence. These patterns indicate that the rebellion's violence was guided by religious specialists who understood appropriate procedures for appeasing Celtic gods through the destruction of their enemies. The ultimate failure of Boudica's rebellion resulted partly from the rebels' inability to maintain coordinated strategy once Roman forces returned from Mona and concentrated their efforts on suppressing the uprising. The destruction of Druidic leadership on Anglesey had eliminated crucial coordination capabilities that might have enabled more effective resistance to Roman counterattacks. The scattered nature of Celtic forces following their initial victories reflected the loss of institutional structures that had previously enabled coordinated military planning across tribal boundaries. The Roman victory over Boudica's forces at the Battle of Watling Street demonstrated the military superiority of disciplined professional soldiers over tribal warriors, despite the rebels' numerical advantages and desperate motivation. The tactical coordination displayed by Roman forces under Suetonius' command contrasted sharply with the individualistic fighting style of Celtic warriors who lacked the institutional training and organisational structures necessary for sustained military campaigns against professional armies. This military defeat effectively ended organised Celtic resistance to Roman rule in southern Britain and eliminated the political context within which Druidic institutions could function effectively. The gradual Romanisation of Celtic elites following the suppression of major resistance movements created social and economic incentives for abandoning traditional religious practices in favour of Roman alternatives that offered access to imperial opportunities and protection from continued persecution. The construction of Roman-style villas, the adoption of Roman educational systems, and the participation in Roman religious cults provided pathways for social advancement that required demonstration of loyalty to imperial values and rejection of indigenous traditions. Archaeological evidence from elite Celtic sites during the later 1st century AD shows dramatic changes in material culture that reflect this cultural transformation. The economic benefits of collaboration with Roman administration attracted ambitious individuals who recognised that traditional Celtic social structures offered limited opportunities for advancement compared to the imperial system's meritocratic elements. The Roman emphasis on education, legal expertise, and administrative competence provided alternative routes to social status
that did not depend on traditional aristocratic bloodlines or religious authority. Young Celts who might previously have sought Druidic training increasingly pursued Roman education that offered practical advantages in the evolving political and economic environment. The urban centres established by Roman administration created new social environments where traditional Celtic religious practices became increasingly marginalised and irrelevant to daily life. The Roman emphasis on public buildings, commercial activities and administrative functions created social contexts that favoured Roman cultural practices over indigenous traditions. The archaeological record from Roman British towns shows minimal evidence for traditional Celtic religious activities, suggesting that urbanisation itself served as a mechanism for cultural transformation that gradually eliminated the social contexts within which Druidic institutions had previously functioned. The legal reforms implemented by Roman administrators systematically displaced traditional Celtic law with Roman legal procedures that offered greater consistency, written documentation, and appeal processes that many individuals found preferable to traditional oral legal systems. The Roman emphasis on individual rights, property protection, and commercial law provided frameworks for economic development that traditional Celtic legal systems had not adequately addressed. The practical advantages of Roman law created incentives for its adoption that gradually undermined the judicial functions that had been central to Druidic authority within Celtic society. The arrival of Christian missionaries in Celtic lands during the 4th and 5th centuries AD encountered not a religious vacuum left by Roman suppression, but resilient networks of indigenous spiritual practitioners who had adapted their traditions to survive systematic persecution. In Ireland, where Roman conquest had never reached, Druidic institutions remained largely intact, providing a unique laboratory for observing how Celtic religious traditions negotiated with the new Christian faith. The missionary activities of figures like St. Patrick, beginning around 432 AD, revealed the sophisticated theological and intellectual capabilities of Irish Druids who engaged in complex debates about cosmology, ethics, and divine authority that demonstrated their continued vitality as a learned class. Archaeological evidence from 5th century Irish settlements reveals the gradual transformation of traditional Celtic religious sites rather than their abandonment. At Tara, the ancient seat of Irish high kingship, excavations have uncovered Christian burials positioned alongside earlier pagan interments, suggesting a period of religious coexistence rather than immediate replacement. The famous Lia Fail, or Stone of Destiny, continued to function in royal inauguration ceremonies that blended Christian blessing with traditional Celtic concepts of sacred kingship. The positioning of early Christian churches at sites previously associated with Druidic activities indicates deliberate strategies of accommodation rather than confrontation with existing religious traditions. The conversion strategies employed by early Christian missionaries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Celtic religious psychology and social organisation. Rather than demanding immediate abandonment of all traditional practices, missionary saints like Columba and Brigid established Christian communities that incorporated familiar elements of Celtic spiritual life, while gradually introducing new theological concepts. The monastic schools they founded adopted educational methods that parallel Druidic training systems, including emphasis on memorization, oral transmission of knowledge, and the integration of practical skills with spiritual instruction. This pedagogical continuity enabled the preservation of Celtic intellectual traditions within Christian institutional frameworks. The figure of St. Brigid of Kildare exemplifies the complex process of religious transformation that characterised early medieval Ireland. Historical analysis suggests that the Christian saint may have been constructed upon the foundation of the Celtic goddess Brigid, whose associations with smithcraft, healing and poetry were seamlessly transferred to her Christian counterpart.
The monastery at Kildare maintained an eternal flame that directly paralleled pre-Christian Celtic fire worship, while the saint's patronage of metalworking and textile production continued ancient associations between divine inspiration and skilled craftsmanship. Archaeological investigation of the Kildare site has revealed evidence for continuous religious activity spanning the transition from pagan to Christian worship, including metalworking facilities and craft production areas that maintain traditional Celtic technological practices. The preservation of Celtic mythological narratives within Christian scriptural contexts demonstrates the sophisticated strategies employed by converted Druids to maintain their cultural heritage while adapting to new religious requirements. The Book of Invasions, compiled by Christian scribes but preserving ancient Celtic origin myths, reveals how traditional genealogies connecting human rulers to divine ancestors were reinterpreted within biblical frameworks that traced Celtic peoples back to Noah's descendants. This genealogical reconstruction required extensive knowledge of both Celtic oral traditions and Christian scriptural scholarship, indicating collaboration between former Druidic specialists and Christian clerics who shared common interests in preserving historical knowledge. The legal texts preserved in early medieval Irish manuscripts reveal the gradual integration of Celtic customary law with Christian canonical requirements through processes of selective adaptation rather than wholesale replacement. The Brecon Laws, compiled during the 7th and 8th centuries, maintain distinctly Celtic legal concepts, including complex systems of honour prices, kinship obligations and territorial rights that had been central to pre-Christian social organisation. However, these traditional elements were modified to accommodate Christian ethical principles regarding marriage, property rights, and judicial procedures. The technical legal vocabulary preserved in these texts demonstrates the survival of specialised Druidic knowledge within Christian institutional contexts. The astronomical knowledge maintained by Celtic scholars within Christian monasteries enabled the development of sophisticated calendar systems that coordinated Christian liturgical requirements with traditional Celtic seasonal observances. The computer's texts produced in Irish monasteries during the 7th and 8th centuries reveal mathematical capabilities that could only have been preserved through continuous transmission from pre-Christian astronomical specialists. The controversy over Easter dating that divided Celtic and Roman Christian communities reflected not merely theological disagreements, but competing systems of astronomical calculation that preserved different approaches to celestial observation and mathematical computation. The monastery of Bangor, founded by St Comgall in the 6th century, became a major centre for astronomical studies that attracted scholars from across Europe seeking access to Celtic computational expertise. The antiphonary of Bangor, dating to the late 7th century, contains astronomical tables and mathematical treatises that demonstrate the integration of traditional Celtic astronomical knowledge with Christian chronological requirements. The precision of these calculations and their consistency with independent astronomical observations indicate that Irish monasteries had successfully preserved and developed the scientific traditions that had been central to Druidic education. Botanical knowledge preserved in early Christian Irish texts reveals the continuation of traditional Celtic herbal medicine within new institutional contexts that emphasise divine healing alongside natural remedies. The medical tracts contained in manuscripts like the Book of Leinster demonstrate sophisticated understanding of plant pharmacology, surgical procedures, and therapeutic applications that clearly derived from pre-Christian Celtic medical traditions. However, these practical treatments were now embedded within Christian theological frameworks that attributed healing powers to divine intervention, working through natural means rather than to the inherent magical properties of plants and procedures. The Irish monastery of Glendalough, established by St Kevin in the 6th century, developed extensive botanical gardens that served both practical medical needs and educational purposes for training Christian healers in traditional Celtic therapeutic knowledge. Archaeological investigation of the site has revealed evidence for systematic cultivation of medicinal plants, specialized preparation facilities, and storage areas for processed herbal remedies. The integration of traditional Celtic botanical knowledge with Christian healing practices enabled the preservation of sophisticated medical traditions that might otherwise have been lost during the transition to Christianity. The transformation of Celtic sacred geography under Christian influence involved the strategic positioning of churches, monasteries, and holy sites at locations previously associated with pre-Christian religious activities. This practice, known as Interpretatio Christiana, enabled the preservation of traditional sacred landscapes while redirecting their spiritual significance toward Christian purposes. Archaeological surveys of early medieval Irish religious sites reveal consistent patterns of Christian construction at locations previously marked by stone circles, burial mounds, and other indicators of pre-Christian sacred activity. The continuity of sacred space usage suggests deliberate policies of accommodation rather than confrontation with existing religious geography. The holy wells that proliferate throughout Ireland and Wales demonstrate the successful integration of Celtic water worship traditions with Christian devotional practices. These sites typically feature natural springs associated with particular saints whose legendary activities often mirror the functions of pre-Christian Celtic deities. Archaeological investigation of holy wells has revealed evidence for continuous religious use spanning the transition from paganism to Christianity, including votive deposits, pilgrimage activities, and healing ceremonies that maintain distinctly Celtic characteristics within Christian interpretive frameworks. The ritual procedures observed at these sites, including directional circuits, specific prayers, and seasonal celebrations, preserve ancient Celtic ceremonial patterns adapted to Christian theological requirements. The Welsh monastery of Llantwit Major, founded by St Illtyd in the late 5th century, became a crucial centre for the preservation and transmission of Celtic scholarly traditions within Christian educational contexts. The school established at Llantwit attracted students from across Britain and Ireland who sought access to both Christian theological instruction and traditional Celtic intellectual disciplines, including law, medicine, astronomy, and poetry. The curriculum developed at Llantwit integrated Christian scriptural studies with traditional Celtic educational methods, enabling the preservation of indigenous intellectual traditions within new institutional frameworks. The scholarly activities at Llantwit Major produced some of the most important early medieval Welsh texts that preserve Celtic historical and legal traditions within Christian literary contexts. The compilation of Welsh law codes during the 10th century drew heavily upon traditional Celtic legal concepts that had been preserved and developed within Christian monastic schools. The technical legal vocabulary and procedural details contained in these texts demonstrate the successful transmission of specialized Druidic knowledge through Christian educational institutions that maintained continuity with pre-Christian intellectual traditions. The development of Celtic Christianity in Scotland reveals similar patterns of accommodation and transformation that enabled the preservation of indigenous religious and intellectual traditions within Christian institutional frameworks. The monastery of Iona, founded by St Columba in 563 AD, became a major centre for the integration of Celtic and Christian cultural elements that influenced religious development throughout Scotland and northern England. The artistic achievements of Iona, including illuminated manuscripts and stone sculptures, demonstrate the synthesis of Celtic artistic traditions with Christian iconographic requirements that created distinctive hybrid cultural forms. The Book of Kells, produced at Iona and related Celtic monasteries during the 8th and 9th centuries, exemplifies the sophisticated integration of Celtic artistic traditions with Christian theological content. The intricate interlace patterns, stylized animal forms, and geometric designs that characterize the manuscript's decoration derive directly from pre-Christian Celtic artistic traditions while serving Christian devotional purposes.
The technical expertise required to produce such elaborate artwork could only have been maintained through continuous transmission from pre-Christian Celtic craftsmen who adapted their skills to Christian requirements. The missionary activities of Celtic monks throughout Europe during the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries carried distinctive intellectual and spiritual traditions that reflected their origins in societies where Celtic and Christian elements had achieved successful synthesis. Figures like St. Columbanus, who established monasteries across Gaul and northern Italy, brought educational methods, artistic techniques, and theological perspectives that preserved Celtic intellectual traditions within broader European Christian culture. The manuscripts produced at these Celtic foundations demonstrate the international influence of educational systems that had successfully integrated pre-Christian Celtic learning with Christian theological scholarship. The survival of Celtic languages throughout the medieval period provided crucial vehicles for the preservation of pre-Christian cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost during Christianization. Irish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic maintained extensive vocabularies related to traditional law, medicine, astronomy, and religious practices that preserved specialized knowledge from the pre-Christian period. The technical terminology contained in medieval Celtic texts demonstrates the continuation of intellectual traditions that required specialized training to understand and apply correctly. The preservation of this vocabulary within Christian literary contexts enabled the transmission of Celtic knowledge systems across the transition to Christianity. The legal traditions preserved in medieval Celtic texts reveal sophisticated systems of jurisprudence that maintained distinctly Celtic characteristics while adapting to Christian ethical requirements. The Welsh laws of Hywel Dda, compiled during the 10th century, preserve legal concepts and procedural details that clearly derive from pre-Christian Celtic customary law, while incorporating Christian principles regarding marriage, property rights, and judicial authority. The technical precision of these legal texts and their consistency with earlier Celtic legal traditions indicate the survival of specialized legal knowledge through the conversion period. The medical knowledge preserved in medieval Celtic texts demonstrates the successful integration of traditional Celtic healing practices with Christian theological frameworks that emphasize divine intervention in therapeutic processes. The Irish medical tracts contained in manuscripts like Liber Flavus Fergusiorum reveal sophisticated understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical procedures that clearly derive from pre-Christian Celtic medical traditions. However, these practical treatments were now embedded within Christian interpretive frameworks that attributed healing success to divine grace, working through natural means rather than to inherent magical properties of therapeutic procedures. The astronomical knowledge maintained in Celtic monasteries enabled significant contributions to medieval European science through the preservation and development of computational techniques that had originated in pre-Christian Celtic intellectual traditions. The Easter controversy that divided Celtic and Roman Christianity reflected competing astronomical calculation systems that preserved different approaches to celestial observation and mathematical computation. The resolution of these controversies required sophisticated astronomical knowledge that demonstrated the continued vitality of Celtic scientific traditions within Christian institutional contexts. The transformation of Druids into Christian hermits, scholars, and advisors in medieval literature reveals the complex processes through which Celtic intellectual traditions adapted to Christian cultural requirements. The figure of Merlin in Arthurian romance exemplifies this transformation, presenting a character who combines traditional Celtic magical knowledge with Christian moral guidance in ways that made ancient wisdom accessible within medieval Christian cultural contexts. The literary development of such figures demonstrates the continued appeal of Celtic intellectual traditions and their successful adaptation to Christian narrative frameworks. The historical Myrddin, whose legendary career provided the foundation for later Arthurian Merlin traditions,
represents the actual process through which Celtic learned specialists adapted to Christian cultural dominance while maintaining their traditional roles as advisors to political leaders. Welsh texts describe Myrddin as a bard and prophet who served various kings while maintaining knowledge of traditional Celtic wisdom, including prophecy, natural philosophy, and historical memory. His legendary madness and retreat to the wilderness reflect the psychological and social pressures experienced by Celtic intellectuals during the transition to Christianity. The preservation of Celtic cultural memory through medieval literature created a fascinating paradox. While historical Druidism had been systematically suppressed by Roman conquest and gradually transformed by Christian conversion, the literary imagination of medieval writers began constructing increasingly elaborate and romanticized portraits of these ancient figures that bore little resemblance to their historical counterparts. This literary transformation occurred primarily through Welsh and Irish manuscript traditions that, while claiming to preserve ancient wisdom, actually reflected the cultural anxieties and intellectual preoccupations of medieval Christian society more than authentic pre-Christian Celtic religious practices. The Mabinogion, compiled from earlier oral traditions during the 11th and 12th centuries, presents Druids as mysterious figures possessing supernatural knowledge and magical abilities that far exceeded anything described in classical sources or supported by archaeological evidence. The four branches of the Mabinogi contain characters like Mathfab Mathunwi, described as a master of enchantment who could transform humans into animals and create living beings from flowers and vegetation. These literary portraits emphasize magical transformation and supernatural manipulation of natural forces, rather than the historical Druidic functions of legal arbitration, education, and religious ceremony documented in earlier sources. The literary development of Druidic characters in Welsh medieval texts reveals systematic expansion of their supposed capabilities to include powers that classical authors had never attributed to historical Druids. The figure of Gwydion in the fourth branch of the Mabinogi demonstrates abilities including shape-shifting, illusion creation, and the animation of inanimate objects that reflect medieval European folklore traditions rather than authentic Celtic religious practices. Archaeological evidence from Celtic sites shows no material culture associated with the elaborate magical practices described in these literary sources, suggesting that medieval writers were creating fantasy figures rather than preserving historical traditions. The narrative structure of these Welsh tales consistently portrays Druidic figures as operating outside normal social constraints and possessing knowledge that transcends ordinary human understanding. The character of Manawydan in the third branch demonstrates abilities to curse entire kingdoms, create phantom armies, and manipulate agricultural fertility through supernatural means that bear no relationship to the historical Druidic functions documented in classical sources. These literary developments reflect medieval Christian concepts of supernatural power rather than authentic pre-Christian Celtic religious beliefs and practices. The Irish manuscript tradition developed parallel romanticized portraits of Druidic figures that emphasize their roles as prophets and advisors to legendary kings, while attributing to them magical abilities that exceeded anything documented in historical sources. The Ulster Cycle, compiled during the 8th through 12th centuries, presents Druids as essential characters in heroic narratives who possess the ability to predict future events, control weather patterns, and influence the outcomes of battles through supernatural intervention. The figure of Cathbad, advisor to King Conchobar mac Nessa, demonstrates prophetic abilities that enable him to foresee the tragic consequences of various actions while possessing magical knowledge that allows him to alter natural processes. The literary portrayal of Cathbad in the Tainbo Bo Cuailnge reveals systematic expansion of Druidic capabilities beyond their historical functions, to include powers of divination that could predict specific future events with perfect accuracy. The text describes Cathbad's ability to determine the exact consequences of particular actions, including the tragic fate that would befall the warrior Cuchulainn if he took up arms on a specific day. These prophetic abilities reflect medieval literary conventions regarding wise advisors rather than authentic Celtic religious practices documented in historical sources. The educational functions attributed to literary Druids in Irish texts demonstrate significant expansion beyond the historical 20-year training period described by Caesar to include instruction in magical arts that have no basis in documented Celtic religious practices. The figure of Fintan mac Bocra, described as surviving multiple world ages and possessing complete knowledge of Irish history from creation to the present, represents literary elaboration that transforms historical Druidic educational functions into supernatural omniscience. These literary developments reflect medieval Christian concepts of divine revelation rather than authentic Celtic intellectual traditions. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, completed around 1136, represents the most influential medieval transformation of Celtic learned figures through its creation of Merlin as the archetypal wizard advisor, whose supernatural abilities far exceeded anything attributed to historical Druids. Geoffrey's Merlin combines elements from Welsh traditions regarding the prophet Myrddin with classical references to Celtic religious specialists, but the resulting character possesses magical abilities that reflect medieval European concepts of supernatural power rather than authentic Celtic religious practices. The systematic elaboration of Merlin's capabilities throughout Geoffrey's narrative demonstrates the medieval tendency to transform historical Celtic figures into fantasy characters suited to contemporary literary tastes. Geoffrey's portrayal of Merlin's prophetic abilities includes detailed predictions regarding future English kings and political events that demonstrate the author's use of Celtic legendary figures to validate contemporary political arrangements rather than preserve authentic historical traditions. The prophecies of Merlin, incorporated into the Historia Regum Britanniae, present elaborate allegorical predictions that reflect 12th century political concerns rather than authentic Celtic prophetic traditions. The systematic nature of these prophecies and their specific relevance to Norman political interests reveal Geoffrey's deliberate construction of pseudo-historical authority rather than preservation of genuine Celtic cultural memory. The magical abilities attributed to Merlin in Geoffrey's narrative include the transportation of massive stone monuments from Ireland to England, the transformation of human appearance to enable deception, and the manipulation of natural forces to achieve military objectives. These supernatural capabilities far exceed anything documented regarding historical Druids in classical sources or archaeological evidence, suggesting that Geoffrey was creating a fantasy figure suited to medieval literary conventions, rather than preserving authentic Celtic traditions. The specific magical techniques described in the text reflect medieval European folklore regarding wizards and enchanters, rather than documented Celtic religious practices. The architectural achievements attributed to Merlin in Geoffrey's account, including the construction of Stonehenge through supernatural means, demonstrate the medieval tendency to attribute ancient monuments to magical intervention rather than understanding the sophisticated engineering capabilities of prehistoric societies. Geoffrey's description of Merlin transporting the giant's ring from Mount Killarrows in Ireland to Salisbury Plain through supernatural levitation reflects medieval inability to comprehend the actual construction techniques employed by Neolithic builders. This literary explanation for Stonehenge's construction became widely accepted throughout medieval Europe despite its complete lack of historical foundation. The political functions attributed to Merlin in Arthurian literature reveal systematic expansion of historical Druidic advisory roles to include direct manipulation of royal succession and the supernatural validation of the political authority. Geoffrey's account of Merlin's role in arranging the conception of Arthur through magical deception of Igraine demonstrates the transformation of historical Celtic concepts of sacred kingship into medieval fantasy narratives. The elaborate supernatural mechanisms described in these accounts bear no relationship to documented Celtic royal inauguration ceremonies or concepts of divine kingship preserved in historical sources. The development of Arthurian romance during the 12th and 13th centuries further elaborated the figure of Merlin as the archetypal wise counsellor whose supernatural knowledge enabled him to guide Arthur's reign while foreseeing its ultimate tragic conclusion. The French romances of Chrétien de Troyes and Robert de Boron present Merlin as possessing complete knowledge of past, present and future events, while maintaining the ability to manipulate natural and supernatural forces to achieve desired outcomes. These literary developments reflect medieval European concepts of ideal royal advisors rather than authentic Celtic religious or intellectual traditions. The magical artifacts associated with Merlin in Arthurian literature, including the sword Excalibur and the Round Table, demonstrate the systematic elaboration of supernatural elements that have no basis in documented Celtic material culture or religious practices. Archaeological evidence from Celtic sites reveals sophisticated metalworking capabilities and ceremonial objects, but nothing comparable to the magical weapons and furniture described in medieval Romance literature. The specific supernatural properties attributed to these artifacts reflect medieval European folklore traditions, rather than authentic Celtic religious concepts regarding sacred objects. The educational relationship between Merlin and Arthur, described in medieval literature, transforms historical Druidic teaching functions into supernatural instruction that includes training in magical arts, prophetic interpretation, and the manipulation of otherworldly powers. The systematic curriculum attributed to Merlin's instruction far exceeds the documented educational practices of historical Druids, while incorporating elements of medieval European magical traditions that have no basis in Celtic cultural history. These literary developments reflect contemporary medieval interests in supernatural knowledge rather than preservation of authentic Celtic intellectual traditions. The Irish manuscript tradition preserved in texts like the Acalmna Senurach presents Druids as essential figures in the legendary Fianna cycle, whose supernatural abilities enable them to serve as advisors, healers, and magical practitioners for the warrior bands led by Finn mac Cumhaill. The figure of Finn himself is often described as possessing Druidic knowledge, including the ability to gain supernatural insight through ritual procedures and the power to communicate with otherworldly beings. These literary portrayals systematically expand historical Druidic functions to include magical abilities that reflect medieval Irish folklore rather than documented pre-Christian religious practices. The preservation of Brecon law in medieval Irish legal texts reveals authentic continuity with pre-Christian Celtic legal traditions, while demonstrating the gradual transformation of these systems under Christian influence. The legal procedures described in texts like the Senchus Ma maintain distinctly Celtic characteristics, including complex honour price systems, kinship-based legal responsibilities, and territorial rights that clearly derive from pre-Christian customary law. However, the integration of Christian ethical principles and the systematic organisation of legal materials reflect medieval scholarly methods rather than authentic pre-Christian Celtic legal practices. The technical legal vocabulary preserved in Brecon law texts demonstrates the survival of specialised Celtic legal knowledge through the conversion period, while revealing significant modifications to accommodate Christian theological requirements. The precise definitions of legal terms and the systematic organisation of legal procedures indicate sophisticated intellectual traditions that required extensive training to master completely. The consistency of legal terminology across different manuscript traditions suggests successful preservation of authentic Celtic legal concepts despite their integration within Christian cultural frameworks. The medical knowledge preserved in medieval Irish texts like the Liber Flavus Fergusiorum reveals authentic continuity with pre-Christian Celtic healing traditions, while demonstrating systematic integration with medieval European medical theories. The herbal remedies and surgical procedures described in these texts maintain distinctly Celtic characteristics, including specific plant preparations, therapeutic applications, and treatment protocols that clearly derive from pre-Christian medical traditions. However, the theoretical frameworks employed to explain disease causation and therapeutic effectiveness reflect medieval Christian concepts of divine intervention rather than authentic Celtic medical philosophy. The astronomical knowledge maintained in Irish monasteries during the medieval period enabled significant contributions to European computational science through the preservation and development of calendar systems that originated in pre-Christian Celtic intellectual traditions. The Computus texts produced at centres like Bangor and Clonmacnoise demonstrate mathematical capabilities that could only have been preserved through continuous transmission from pre-Christian astronomical specialists. The precision of these calculations and their integration with Christian liturgical requirements reveal successful adaptation of Celtic scientific knowledge to medieval European scholarly contexts. The mythological cycles preserved in medieval Irish literature maintain authentic Celtic narrative structures and thematic elements, while demonstrating systematic elaboration that reflects medieval literary conventions rather than pure preservation of pre-Christian traditions. The mythological cycle, including texts like Le Borg Bala Iren, presents elaborate origin narratives that integrate Celtic creation myths with biblical chronology through sophisticated genealogical reconstructions. These literary syntheses required extensive knowledge of both Celtic oral traditions and Christian scriptural scholarship, indicating collaboration between former Druidic specialists and Christian clerics. The gradual transformation of historical Druidic figures into literary archetypes of wisdom and supernatural power reflects broader medieval European interests in ancient knowledge and magical practices, rather than authentic preservation of Celtic cultural memory. The systematic elaboration of Druidic capabilities in medieval literature created fantasy figures that bore little resemblance to their historical counterparts while serving contemporary literary and political purposes. The influence of these romanticized portraits on later European literature and popular culture demonstrates the power of medieval literary imagination to reshape historical understanding according to contemporary cultural needs and aesthetic preferences. The scholarly methods employed by medieval Celtic writers in compiling and organizing traditional materials reveal sophisticated approaches to cultural preservation that balanced authentic historical elements with contemporary literary requirements. The systematic organization of legal texts, the compilation of mythological narratives, and the preservation of technical vocabulary demonstrate intellectual capabilities that maintained continuity with pre-Christian Celtic scholarly traditions while adapting to medieval European academic standards. These scholarly achievements enabled the preservation of significant amounts of authentic Celtic cultural material within literary contexts that made ancient traditions accessible to medieval Christian audiences. The 18th century witnessed an extraordinary transformation in European attitudes toward ancient Celtic culture, driven by Enlightenment ideals that celebrated natural wisdom over classical authority and primitive virtue over civilized corruption. This intellectual revolution found its most influential champion in William Stukely, whose antiquarian investigations at Stonehenge and Avebury between 1719 and 1724 fundamentally reshaped European understanding of prehistoric Britain while establishing the foundation for modern Druidic revival movements. Stukely's meticulous field surveys employed innovative measurement techniques and systematic documentation methods that represented significant advances in archaeological methodology. Yet, his interpretations reflected contemporary philosophical preoccupations rather than empirical analysis of the evidence he so carefully recorded. Stukely's Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, presented the monument as the surviving remnant of a sophisticated ancient religion that embodied natural philosophical principles superior to both classical paganism and contemporary Christianity. His detailed architectural analysis revealed genuine insights into the monument's construction phases and astronomical alignments, but his attribution of the entire complex to Druidic builders reflected wishful thinking rather than archaeological evidence. The chronological framework Stukely employed placed Stonehenge's construction during the period of documented Druidic activity in Britain, ignoring the monument's actual Neolithic origins by over 2 millennia. This fundamental chronological error became deeply embedded in popular consciousness, and continues to influence public perceptions of Druidism despite overwhelming archaeological evidence for the monument's much earlier construction. The philosophical framework underlying Stukely's Druidic theories drew heavily upon contemporary deist theology that sought evidence for natural religion uncorrupted by institutional dogma or classical learning. Stukely portrayed the ancient Druids as monotheistic philosophers who worshipped a supreme deity through observation of natural phenomena and astronomical cycles, making them proto-Christians who had achieved religious truth through reason rather than revelation. This interpretation served contemporary intellectual needs by providing ancient precedent for Enlightenment religious philosophy, while establishing Britain's claim to a noble prehistoric heritage that rivaled or exceeded classical antiquity. Stukely's field investigations at Avebury revealed an even more extensive prehistoric ritual landscape that he interpreted as evidence for sophisticated Druidic religious organisation spanning vast geographical areas. His discovery of the West Kennet Avenue connecting the stone circle to other monuments demonstrated genuine archaeological insights that anticipated modern landscape archaeology by over 2 centuries. However, his interpretation of the entire complex as a massive serpent temple dedicated to Druidic worship reflected symbolic thinking rather than empirical analysis of the archaeological evidence. The elaborate mythological framework Stukely constructed to explain Avebury's layout and function created a compelling narrative that influenced antiquarian thought throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The impact of Stukely's work extended far beyond academic antiquarianism to influence broader cultural movements that sought alternatives to established religious and political authority. His portrayal of ancient British Druids as wise legislators and natural philosophers provided intellectual ammunition for political reformers who argued that Britain's ancient constitution embodied principles of liberty and justice that had been corrupted by Norman conquest and ecclesiastical tyranny. The idealization of Druidic society as a golden age of natural democracy and religious tolerance served contemporary political purposes while establishing mythological foundations for emerging British national identity. The Welsh scholar and forger Iolo Morganthalsy carried Stukely's romanticisation of ancient Druidism to extraordinary extremes through the systematic fabrication of medieval manuscripts that purported to preserve authentic ancient Welsh traditions. Between 1789 and his death in 1826, Iolo produced hundreds of forged documents, including bardic genealogies, Druidic rituals, and philosophical treatises that claim to transmit genuine Celtic wisdom through continuous oral tradition. The sophistication of these forgeries, written in archaic Welsh and incorporating genuine historical elements, deceived scholars for over a century while fundamentally shaping modern understanding of Welsh cultural heritage and Celtic spirituality. Iolo's most influential creation was the Gorset of the Bards of the Isle of Britain, established in 1792 as a supposedly ancient institution that preserved authentic Druidic traditions through an unbroken chain of Welsh poets and scholars. The elaborate ceremonies Iolo designed for the Gorset combined genuine elements of Welsh poetic tradition with invented rituals that drew upon his extensive knowledge of classical sources, medieval literature, and contemporary Masonic practices. The stone circles he constructed for Gorset ceremonies at locations throughout Wales created new sacred sites that appeared ancient while actually representing 18th century Romantic interpretations of prehistoric religious practices.
The philosophical framework underlying Iolo's invented Druidism reflected Enlightenment ideals of natural religion, democratic governance, and universal human rights that he projected backward onto ancient Celtic society. His forged texts presented Druids as monotheistic philosophers who taught the immortality of the soul, the brotherhood of all humanity, and the importance of individual conscience over institutional authority. These teachings served contemporary Unitarian and radical political movements while providing Wales with a cultural heritage that competed with English claims to classical inheritance and Scottish Highland Romanticism. The institutional structures Iolo created for his revived Druidism included elaborate hierarchies of bardic degrees, initiation ceremonies, and educational curricula that claimed to preserve ancient Celtic wisdom while actually reflecting 18th century educational theory and Masonic organisational methods. The Gorsed's emphasis on competitive poetry, scholarly achievement, and moral instruction attracted genuine Welsh intellectuals who contributed to the institution's growth while remaining unaware of its fabricated origins. The integration of authentic Welsh cultural elements with invented traditions created hybrid institutions that served real cultural needs despite their fraudulent historical foundations. The Victorian era witnessed an explosion of interest in Celtic culture that transformed academic Celtic studies while spawning numerous organisations claiming to preserve or revive ancient Druidic traditions. The publication of Charlotte Guest's translation of the Mabinogion made Welsh medieval literature accessible to English readers, while the work of scholars like John Rhys and Kuno Meyer established Celtic philology as a legitimate academic discipline. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 19th century gradually revealed the genuine complexity and sophistication of prehistoric Celtic civilization, while simultaneously undermining romantic theories about Druidic construction of megalithic monuments. The ancient order of Druids, founded in London in 1781, represented the earliest attempt to create a modern organisation based upon supposed ancient Druidic principles, though its actual structure and practices derived primarily from Freemasonry rather than authentic Celtic traditions. The order's emphasis on mutual aid, charitable activities, and moral instruction attracted middle-class members throughout Britain and its colonies while providing social networks that served practical economic and political functions. The ritualistic elements incorporated into order ceremonies drew upon classical sources and romantic literature rather than genuine Celtic religious practices, creating theatrical performances that satisfied contemporary desires for ancient wisdom and mysterious knowledge. The proliferation of Druidic orders throughout the 19th century reflected broader Victorian interests in alternative spirituality, ancient wisdom, and exotic religious traditions that offered alternatives to established Christianity. The United Ancient Order of Druids, established in 1833, developed elaborate degree systems and initiation ceremonies that claimed to transmit genuine Celtic knowledge while actually providing social clubs for urban professionals seeking community and meaning in rapidly industrializing society. The theatrical costumes, ceremonial implements, and architectural settings these organizations employed created impressive spectacles that satisfied romantic desires for connection with ancient traditions while serving contemporary social and economic needs. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries gradually revolutionized scholarly understanding of prehistoric European civilization while undermining many romantic theories about ancient Druidism. The excavation of Swiss lake villages revealed sophisticated Bronze Age communities that predated historical Celtic culture, while the investigation of megalithic monuments throughout Europe demonstrated their Neolithic origins millennia before the emergence of recognisable Celtic civilization. The development of scientific dating methods, particularly radiocarbon dating after 1950, provided definitive chronological frameworks that demolished romantic theories linking Druids to Stonehenge, Avebury, and other prehistoric monuments.
The discovery of genuine Celtic archaeological sites throughout Europe revealed the actual material culture of Iron Age Celtic civilization, while demonstrating both its sophistication and its differences from Romantic reconstructions. Excavations at Oppidar like Manching in Germany and Bibracte in France uncovered evidence for complex urban settlements, advanced metallurgy, and extensive trade networks that contradicted Romantic portrayals of Druids as primitive nature worshippers living in forest groves. The systematic investigation of Celtic religious sites revealed sophisticated ritual practices and architectural achievements that surpassed Romantic expectations while differing significantly from invented modern traditions. The decipherment of ancient Celtic inscriptions throughout Europe provided direct access to Celtic languages and religious concepts that enabled scholarly reconstruction of genuine Celtic beliefs and practices. The discovery of the Coligny calendar demonstrated sophisticated Celtic astronomical knowledge, while curse tablets from Bath and other sites revealed the actual concerns and religious practices of historical Celtic communities. These primary sources enabled scholars to distinguish authentic Celtic traditions from medieval literary elaborations and modern Romantic inventions, while providing foundations for genuine historical understanding of Celtic civilization. The development of comparative Indo-European studies during the late 19th and early 20th centuries placed Celtic culture within broader linguistic and cultural contexts that revealed its genuine historical relationships and developmental patterns. The work of scholars like Julius Pokorny and Calvert Watkins demonstrated the Indo-European origins of Celtic religious terminology and mythological concepts, while revealing the specific innovations that characterized Celtic cultural development. This scholarly framework enabled more accurate understanding of Celtic religion's relationship to other ancient European traditions, while undermining Romantic theories about unique Celtic wisdom and spiritual superiority. The emergence of Celtic nationalism throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries provided political contexts that encouraged both scholarly investigation of genuine Celtic heritage and the invention of traditions that served contemporary identity needs. The Irish cultural revival associated with figures like Douglas Hyde and Lady Gregory combined serious scholarly work on medieval Irish literature with Romantic elaborations that emphasize Celtic spiritual superiority and cultural uniqueness. Similar movements in Wales, Scotland and Brittany created hybrid cultural identities that incorporated genuine historical elements with invented traditions designed to support political autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. The 20th century witnessed the emergence of Neo-Druidism as a distinct religious movement that acknowledged its modern origins while claiming inspiration from ancient Celtic traditions. The Druid Order, reformed by George Watson MacGregor Reed in 1909, abandoned claims to historical continuity while developing nature-based spiritual practices that drew upon Romantic interpretations of Celtic religion combined with contemporary environmental concerns. This approach enabled the creation of meaningful spiritual traditions that served modern needs while avoiding the historical falsifications that had characterized earlier revival movements. The influence of Wiccan and other neo-pagan movements upon modern Druidism created syncretic religious traditions that combined elements from various sources, including Celtic mythology, classical paganism, and contemporary environmental spirituality. Gerald Gardner's Wiccan revival during the 1940s and 1950s established precedents for creating modern pagan religions that claimed ancient origins while acknowledging contemporary construction. The interaction between Wiccan and Druidic revival movements produced hybrid traditions that emphasized seasonal celebrations, nature worship, and goddess spirituality, while drawing upon diverse historical sources for inspiration and legitimation. Contemporary Neo-Druidism encompasses numerous organizations and traditions that range from scholarly historical reconstruction to creative spiritual innovation based upon Celtic themes. The Order of Bards, Ovetes and Druids, established by Ross Nichols in 1964, developed educational programs that combine historical Celtic studies with psychological and spiritual practices designed for contemporary practitioners. The Andreacht Féin, founded by Isaac Bonewits in 1983, emphasises scholarly accuracy and Indo-European comparative methodology while creating practical religious traditions suitable for modern practitioners seeking Celtic-inspired spirituality. The distinction between historical accuracy and modern spiritual practice has become increasingly important within contemporary neo-Druidic movements, as archaeological and historical scholarship has revealed the actual complexity and diversity of ancient Celtic civilization. Responsible neo-Druidic organizations acknowledge the limitations of historical knowledge while creating meaningful spiritual traditions that honor Celtic heritage without making false claims about historical continuity or authentic preservation of ancient practices. This approach enables creative spiritual development while maintaining intellectual honesty about the relationships between ancient Celtic traditions and modern religious innovations. The academic study of Celtic civilization continues to evolve through new archaeological discoveries, improved analytical techniques, and interdisciplinary approaches that integrate material evidence with linguistic and comparative religious studies. Recent excavations at sites like the Heuneberg in Germany and Kufren in France have revealed previously unknown aspects of Celtic urban development and religious practices, while demonstrating the continued potential for new discoveries that expand understanding of Celtic civilization. The application of scientific techniques, including DNA analysis, isotope studies, and environmental reconstruction, provides increasingly detailed pictures of Celtic society that both confirm and challenge earlier scholarly reconstructions. The legacy of Druidism in contemporary culture extends far beyond neo-Druidic religious movements to influence literature, environmental activism, and popular entertainment in ways that reflect continuing fascination with Celtic wisdom and natural spirituality. The portrayal of Druids in fantasy literature, films, and games typically emphasizes their roles as wise counselors and powerful magicians, while drawing upon romantic traditions established during the 18th and 19th centuries rather than historical evidence. These popular cultural representations serve contemporary needs for meaning and connection with nature, while perpetuating romanticized stereotypes that differ significantly from historical Celtic religious specialists. The environmental movement has found particular inspiration in romanticized portrayals of Druids as nature-worshipping philosophers who maintained harmonious relationships with the natural world through spiritual practices that emphasized ecological balance and seasonal rhythms. Contemporary environmental activists often invoke Druidic imagery and concepts to support arguments for ecological preservation and sustainable living, while acknowledging that their interpretations reflect modern concerns rather than authentic ancient practices. This symbolic use of Druidic imagery demonstrates the continued power of Celtic cultural symbols to inspire contemporary movements seeking alternatives to industrial civilization and mechanistic worldviews. The scholarly consensus regarding historical Druidism emphasizes their roles as educated specialists who maintained legal, religious, and intellectual traditions within Iron Age Celtic society while possessing sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Archaeological evidence reveals complex religious practices, advanced technological capabilities, and extensive trade networks that demonstrate the sophistication of Celtic civilization, while differing significantly from romantic portrayals of primitive forest dwellers. The systematic suppression of Druidic institutions by Roman conquest and Christian conversion eliminated the social contexts within which these traditions could function effectively, making authentic historical reconstruction challenging despite the survival of some elements within medieval Celtic
literary and legal traditions. The transformation of historical Druids into symbols of ancient wisdom, natural spirituality, and alternative authority reflects broader cultural needs for meaning and identity that transcend specific historical accuracy. The Romantic revival of Druidism during the 18th and 19th centuries created powerful mythological frameworks that continue to influence contemporary culture despite their limited relationship to historical Celtic civilization. The ongoing popularity of Druidic themes in literature, spirituality, and popular culture demonstrates their continued relevance as symbols of human connection with nature and ancient wisdom, regardless of their historical accuracy. Modern neo-Druidic movements represent creative attempts to develop meaningful spiritual traditions that honour Celtic heritage while acknowledging contemporary construction and avoiding false historical claims. The diversity of contemporary Druidic organisations reflects different approaches to balancing historical inspiration with modern innovation, ranging from scholarly reconstruction efforts to creative spiritual movements that use Celtic themes as starting points for contemporary religious development. This diversity enables individuals with different interests and needs to find appropriate expressions of Celtic-inspired spirituality while maintaining intellectual honesty about the relationships between ancient traditions and modern practices. The story of Druidism thus encompasses both historical Celtic religious specialists who played crucial roles in Iron Age European civilization and the Romantic reconstructions that have made them symbols of ancient wisdom and natural spirituality in modern culture. The archaeological and historical evidence reveals sophisticated intellectual traditions that maintained legal, religious, and educational functions within complex Celtic societies, while literary and popular cultural developments have created mythological figures that serve contemporary spiritual and cultural needs. Understanding both dimensions of Druidic legacy enables appreciation of genuine Celtic cultural achievements while recognizing the creative power of Romantic imagination to reshape historical understanding according to contemporary values and aspirations. The enduring fascination with Druidism reflects fundamental human needs for connection with nature, ancient wisdom, and alternative forms of authority that transcend conventional institutional structures. Whether through scholarly historical reconstruction or creative spiritual innovation, contemporary engagement with Druidic themes continues to provide meaningful frameworks for exploring relationships between human consciousness and natural environments. The legacy of the Druids, both historical and imagined, thus remains vital within contemporary culture as a source of inspiration for those seeking alternatives to mechanistic worldviews and institutional religious authority, demonstrating the continued power of Celtic cultural symbols to inspire human imagination and spiritual development across the millennia.